And we also have Laurelyn Thompson, broadcaster from BC, who's here. So you guys have quite a lineup of speakers here. Thank you. Phone some friends, get them over here. I know there's more people coming up later, and we also got Tom Quiggin on his way. That's going to be showing up here pretty quick. So this is quite a treat for Lloydminster. This was put together by Black Sheep Troop Media, which is pretty well me, and my very small team here. So we managed to do this thing for you guys, and this is about basically informing and connecting our people and empower you, because the knowledge is your power, right? And that knowledge is being kept away from you, as you all know. So today we're going to use our freedom of association and our freedom of speech while we still have it, and we're going to build a little something. So thank you very much, and I don't know if Laurelyn would like to open this thing up and throw some heat in the fire. That would be awesome. You ready, Polly? Here we go. So I introduce you, Laurelyn Thompson from BC Broadcaster, a fighter for Canada. God bless you.
Hello, everybody. Wow, you guys must be real standards for truth and justice if you're out on a Sunday morning in Lloydminster. I just drove 4 hours. I figured out that Alberta is flat. And when I saw a hill coming up, I was excited because it was something different. I loved it. But what beautiful country. It was rolling hills. I had an opportunity to just think about what we're facing. I think I'm going to get a chance to talk a little bit later about how I was targeted. 2 years ago, I did have the perfect life. I really did. I had 2 national television shows. I was an author and a speaker, and I was traveling across North America. And then I discovered that there was this curriculum that they were going to teach in schools, that little boys could become little girls. And I started talking about that, and I got targeted, and my life turned upside down. And so I have paid a very, very high price to stand for freedom in this nation. And I happen to believe that we're in trouble. I happen to believe that there are some things going on that are beginning to shut down our freedoms that we have taken for granted. And I'm worried about it, but I've decided to become part of the solution. I am running for Member of Parliament. Since I got targeted and they gave me a lot more time because I lost my job, I will talk about it later, I have a lot more time to run for politics and to hopefully end up in some seats that can make a difference. And it hasn't been easy the last 2 years, but it has been the most exciting days of my life. I have no regrets about what has happened. I have no regrets about some of the difficulties I've faced, and I certainly have no regrets about being awakened, which a lot of people are not awakened. If you're here, I'm kind of guessing you're one of the awake people, but I can tell you that as I travel across this nation and I speak to certain groups, sometimes it's religious people, sometimes it's not religious people, but people just think everything's fine. And you know what? If you don't say anything controversial, you will think Canada is fabulous and you won't know what anyone's talking about. But if you start talking about some of the ideologies that have been set up in this nation, the transgenderification of our nation, when you begin to see, do you know that there's a very, very serious situation going on in British Columbia? I have just moved to Red Deer, Alberta, where I will be living for an extended period of time, and I'm loving it. Very nice people in Red Deer, Alberta. But in British Columbia, what we've been facing, there is a father from Delta, BC. And he got a call one day from his wife. He and his wife were split up. And he got a call. And she said, you know what? Our daughter has been going through something. And she wants to transition. And I'm at Children's Hospital. And they want to put her on testosterone today. And he said, what? And she said, yeah, like today. It's her first visit. And so he said, I don't think that's a good idea. And she agreed, that's not a good idea. So they shut all of that down for that day. Well, what happened after that is that the mom kept talking to the doctors, and of course the doctors, they're like, oh yeah, you just got to do it. Otherwise she could be in a high suicide rate and a high suicide bracket. And so, you know, this is the right thing to do. If somebody feels like they are a different sex inside their mind, you just head them, you know, into the puberty blockers, life-changing, life-altering, gender-affirming surgery eventually to come. And that's the way we do it here in Canada. And so what happened was that the father began to think that, you know, a young girl at 14 years old doesn't exactly know what she wants, doesn't exactly know you know, all of the things that are necessary, or all of the ramifications to making some serious life-altering decisions. And so he said, I don't want this to happen. And so the mom and the dad got into a little bit of a tussle about it. And eventually the hospital said, you know what, we don't actually need your permission. A 14-year-old in Canada under the Child Infancy Act can make a decision and a determination that they can change their whole life and change their sex and go down a path without parental authorization. Well, he didn't think that was fair. So he then went to court and he began proceedings. And as the proceedings have gone, the courts have ordered that, sir, you will allow your daughter to go through this transitioning. And if you do not, and if you do not participate, and if you do not call her only by the pronouns she chooses and her new name, then you are now guilty of what we are going to call family violence. Family violence. Not only that, sir, but if you talk about this privately, or if you talk about this publicly, you are now subject to arrest without warrant. That's in Canada. How crazy is that? When we talk about God keep our land glorious and free, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble. I didn't know we were in big trouble 2 years ago. And when I share my story later today, hopefully for a few minutes, I'll be able to extrapolate on that. But when you watch what is going on in the news, I was really shocked this week, you know. My whole life I've voted Conservative. And when the MP who stood up and stood for conservatism was forced to apologize and then forced out of his position because he said something that was maybe not that politically correct. Now I know Rob's here, and we heard that he started. Did you start the Conservative Party? Something like that.
Me and several thousand others.
Oh, okay. And when we look at what we're facing, that you're just not allowed to say certain things. In British Columbia, I will tell you that if you go to any of your job places and you start discussing how you don't exactly buy into the whole gender thing, you know, that you kind of think that men are men and women are women. And if you start talking about that in your workplace, you probably won't have a job by the end of the week. And I started realizing that we got a problem in Canada. You can't say certain things. We have M103 that's on the table, Motion 103, the Islamophobia law, that if you dare to criticize this religion of Islam, that you are subject, you can be called before a human rights tribunal. I don't know. I think that everyone's criticizing Christianity. You can criticize atheists if you want to. You can criticize, you know, globalists or people that have an issue with the climate. You can make fun of them if they think that, you know, the world's ending in 11 years, or you can make fun of them if they think there's no problem. The thing about a free democratic society is that you have the ability to criticize ideas so that everything can be sifted. Have you ever been in a marriage where, you know, if there's absolutely no discussion and you don't have a little bit of a fight, you know, sometimes a fight is really revolutionary. Sometimes it kind of clarifies things. You know, the wife says this and the husband says this, and all of a sudden you kind of hear each other and you go, well, you're sort of right there, but you're sort of wrong, and I think this and I think this. And in the end, if you have some good communication skills, what you end up with is a better relationship. That's what we should have in Canada. We should be able to discuss when we have issues with ideas and worldviews and ideologies that do not measure up. Right now, that's right. Right now, they want to shut down and have already shut down in Vancouver conversion therapy. Now, it is my understanding that in days of old, they would take trans people or gay people and they would shock them and try to, shock them with electrodes or whatever. Well, that's ridiculous. But conversion therapy now means that a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a pastor, anybody who's a professional may not receive any funds or be paid for their service to have a good discussion with you about why you might feel like you would like to transition your life. It was about a year and a half or so ago that a transsexual called me up. His name is Morgan Ogre. Have any of you heard of Morgan? Okay, a few of you. So he is the NDP vice president in Vancouver. And he told me that I was getting a bad reputation among the trans people, and because I didn't think it was like science, and I was very nice about it. I never insulted anybody. I just said, something doesn't seem quite scientific. When you're created, you got the chromosomes and all of that. And so I'm just thinking that we shouldn't tell 5-year-olds that they can be a boy or a girl, the opposite, I'm just thinking that. So Morgan called me and he said he wanted to help me. And I said, that would be great. I think I do need help because this is a real tough topic. And so we met for dinner, and for 6 hours, Morgan and I discussed what had happened. He was married, he fathered 2 children, and then he decided he was a woman. And so now he's the mother of 2. He had operations, and he's fully open about this. I'm not telling anything that he wouldn't say. He removed his private parts and had operations. And we sat there and I said, wow, that's quite a journey. And I said, you know what, Morgan, I respect your right as an adult to live any way you want to. Because guess what? That is the freedom of Canada. We don't live in North Korea. We don't live in Iran where they're probably going to throw you off a roof. We live in Canada. And in Canada, you get to cut any private organs that you want out of your body. Go right ahead. In fact, taxpayers are going to pay for it. Wow. Cool country. But I said, Morgan, I'd like to ask you something. I think children should be off the table. I'm okay with you being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, polyamorous, pansexual. I had to look this stuff up. I never heard of it. But it's okay in Canada to live any way you want. But you see, parental rights are under the greatest assault that we have ever seen in our nation. It is historically unprecedented that 5-year-olds, and in fact, preschoolers, are now being taught that they can be gender fluid through books like I Am Jazz. Have you heard of this I Am Jazz book? It's based on a reality series by Jazz Jennings. Jazz Jennings was a young man, and he was raised in a family mostly by his older sister. If you look at the sort of what happened to him, what they say is the older sister, the mom was real busy, so the older sister kind of looked after Jazz, dressed him up in girls' dresses all the time. This has really happened. And so he kind of felt more like he wanted to be a girl. So as time went on, he told his parents that. They went in, they got him puberty blockers, and he began to transition into being more feminine. And so recently on the show, because it's a reality show following this, after he had been receiving the estrogen and all kinds of things to feminize his body, ensure that he didn't get a beard and keep his voice high, they went into the doctor right before he was about to have his operation, and the doctor said, well, there's a bit of a problem. And the problem is that you've taken so many of the hormones and stuff that we don't actually have enough of your male material to cut it away, form it, and form it into female parts. We don't have enough material. And the father was so upset and said, well, what do you mean? And the doctor looked at him and he said, well, this is all experimental. So Jazz has had his operation and now is referred to as a she. And She is living as a woman and apparently has talked openly about it, not too happy with how the operation turned out, and says that he's now about 17, 18 years old, has never felt sexual feelings for anybody. Because everything's all messed up. Because it's a big experiment. And my 5-year-old, if I had a child that young, mine are a little bit older now, but if they go to school, they will be read the book, I Am Jazz. And in the book, I Am Jazz, Jazz in a big, colorful, cartoon-like book will be saying, I am a boy with a girl brain, and I was born that way. And that is indoctrination into little kids, that maybe they could be born that way too. When I tweeted out that there were 5 books that I could find on transgenderism in kindergarten, going across all of our schools in Canada, the president of the BCTF, Glenn Hansman, tweeted back to me, and he said, what are you talking about? There's 5 books on transgenderism. He said there are dozens and dozens and dozens of books on being transgender in our schools. So I said to Morgan Ogre at dinner, I said, I'm okay with you being trans. You're okay with me being hetero? But would you leave the kids out of it? And he said, Laura Lynn, we cannot leave the kids out of it. He said, I regularly go to Ottawa so that we can make laws so that children can be removed from homes with people like you who do not automatically understand that they are allowed to transition. It is wrong. And I said, well, that's not right, Morgan. And so we left as friends that night. After dinner, I was so kind, you know. He asked me for a hug. We had a hug, and he went on about his way. But a few weeks later, there was something interesting that happened. I had a mom call me, and she said that her 17-year-old in grade 12 was skipping out on a mandatory out in schools, which is the LGBTQ classes that were at his school. He was skipping out. And she called me and she said, you know, it's funny because he and his buddy decided to skip out. They went down to the 7-Eleven and there's like 50 kids there and they are all skipping out. And I said, well, that kind of sounds like a story. I'm going to go and talk to them. Is that okay with you? She said, that's fine with me. So I grabbed my cameraman and we headed out to shoot a story. My cameraman's my husband, so he has to come along no matter what. And so we go down there. And right off school property, I meet up with these couple of kids, and in actual fact, it wasn't just 50 kids. They said a total of 100 kids skipped out of this out in school's mandatory LGBTQ class. And I said, wow, so, you know, what happened and why'd you skip out? And I got the whole story from them, and they said, you know, we don't bully, so we don't think we have to keep, you know, being told that, you know, not to bully kids because we've never been bullies. And we're not bullying, so we're not going to go to the class. So I said, right on. And now the school later would not confirm nor deny that there was 100 kids that skipped out of the class, because do they really want to be shown that they're letting their students go all willy-nilly? So here's what happened. The next thing, Morgan Ogre. What he does is he tweets out, and he not only tweets to me, he tweets to the police, and CKNW and Global TV, CTV, CBC, and he says, get this woman under control. He wanted the police to arrest me. Why? Because I was speaking to kids from school without parental permission. And I just could not help myself. At that point, I'm like, let me get this right. And I just, you know, sometimes when you tweet, you tweet slow because you're not, you know, upset about anything, but there are times when you tweet fast and you smack those keys on the keyboard, and I was smacking them and I said, are you kidding me? So let me get this straight. You don't want me to speak to 17-year-olds without parental permission, but by the way, Morgan Ogre, I do have parental permission, but you want to be able to tell our 5-year-olds that they are gender fluid without any consent from parents in this nation. I call that hypocrisy. That is hypocrisy. I couldn't believe it. And so I began to see over this last little bit that there is a real problem going on. That we do not have free speech the way that we thought we did. We do not have parental rights the way that we thought we did. We are not free to worship. Just this last week, if you've heard, there was somebody who, we've all heard of street preachers, right? They go down, they spread the gospel, they talk about the love of God. My mom and dad were missionaries, so my mom was a little bit funny. She'd get her accordion out and she'd play her accordion. I was born in Uganda, East Africa. And so I've seen street preachers. I've seen that in my own mother and father. I've never particularly felt comfortable doing it. But these people do this. Why? Because they think they have a message and they want to share it. And the thing about Canada is you get to share your message. If you want to go to the street corner and talk about, that the earth is, going to end because of, climate change issues, you're allowed to do that. Why? Because we're in Canada. But this guy in Toronto, he just got arrested and taken off to the jailhouse because he was preaching on the street, like we've seen so many people do. Things are happening. Things are changing, and I wonder what's going on. I decided that I was going to have to become a bit more of a fighter than I thought I would be. I really had approval addiction. I don't know if you have that. I think most Canadians do. It's when you just really hope that everybody likes you, because if they don't like you, you kind of feel bad. And then I started discovering that you can't speak truth and continue to feel that you need everyone's approval. And I've had a whole load of people. When we first started doing our meeting, to talk about Soji with the community, I had about 14,000 people who tuned in to my live Facebook feed, and I was shocked. I saw the numbers at first. 14,000 people just turned into my live Facebook feed. I must be so popular. Until I started reading all of the comments that were written. I was called a hater and a bigot and Hitler and a transphobe and a homophobe. And I'm like, wow, I am none of those things. I consider myself to be quite libertarian, quite frankly. I really believe that, even though I'm a Christian at heart, I really believe we all get the right to live any way we want, with or without a God in our lives. I believe in Canada, that's the way we get to live. But I found out that if I dare to have my own opinion, then I'm going to be labeled some things. And Hitler, I never understood that at all. I had to kind of study where on earth that, because I love the Jews. I've never wanted to murder anybody. Rarely have I wanted to do that. But I found out that if you do not conform to the ideology of our nation, that you are under threat of being socially terrorized. And I had that happen. I had it happen. I will share a little bit more about that later today. I'd like to give a chance to other people to talk. But I will say, I've come to this season in my life knowing that if there are not those of us who are willing to pay a price and willing to stand up, we will not recognize our land in 10 years. If we are not willing to say this far and no further, we will not have the Canada that we even see today. It is time to stand. And I've decided I don't care what anybody calls me. I will not bow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I think our next speaker, who just came down from Calgary, Mr. Todd Brown, Executive Director of FIRE, Firearm Institute for Rational Education, co-founder of Concerned Gun Owners of Canada. He's been studying and writing articles on firearms laws for about 10 years. He was a firearm and hunter training instructor for almost 15 years. He's written gun policy for multiple political parties, including the Wild Rose Party, who adopted his policies as a policy convention, and Derek Fildebrandt of the Freedom Conservative Party of Alberta adopted gun policy that he drafted. He's worked with Tim Mohan of the Libertarian Party of Canada, as well as the United Conservative Party of Alberta, and co-wrote the firearm policy for the People Party of Canada. So I introduce you, Mr. Todd Brown from Calgary.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for attending this first, hopefully not the last, of the 2019 Canadian Awareness Conference. Everybody can hear me all right? Okay. My name is Todd Brown, Executive Director for the Firearms Institute for Rational Education. I'm here to talk to you today about legislation and politicians that are stripping us of our rights and freedoms. I'm going to discuss Canadian gun laws and the bureaucrats that implement them. How many here are proud Canadian gun owners? Oh, we got a whole bunch. There we go. If you're not, you should be. Gun owners are the most lawful and vetted members of Canadian society. So what's happening now is the Trudeau government is moving against legal gun owners again. The first big move is the passage of Bill C-71. You guys have heard of that one? Yep, nobody likes it. C-71 has nothing to do with public policy. It is a blatant attack on legal gun owners. There is nothing in this piece of legislation that addresses or refers to criminals or gangs acquiring and using handguns or so-called assault weapons. I say so-called because there is no definition for this fictitious term. The closest thing is an assault rifle, which has full auto capability but is already illegal under Canadian law. This bill has completely targeted Canadian gun owners with new regulations and more red tape, while giving gangs and criminals another free pass. Gun owners will now need permission from the Chief Firearms Officer to transport restricted firearms to and from anywhere but a range. Powers of confiscation have been expanded. Anything that has been seized, detained, or surrendered to the police can now be confiscated outright. The ability of the Chief Firearms Officer to deny a license application has also increased, as background checks have increased from a 5-year term prior to your application to a lifetime check. This gives the CFO more arbitrary power while denying rights to people who have made their life better. And I know there's a few people in here who have turned their lives around. As for the promise of bringing back the long gun registry, broken. As you buy and trade your firearms, you will have to ask for a transfer number from the Chief Firearms Officer, again, so they can track the movement and sale of guns. This information will be gathered to build a new registry. Now, you have to remember, any collection of data that records information on long guns is a long gun registry. This is the same tactic that the RCMP used when the Conservative government repealed the first long gun registry. You guys remember that one? It was referred to as a backdoor registry. The RCMP have been given power to reclassify firearms at will. This gives the RCMP the ability to make law, and remember, the ability of police to make and enforce law is one of the hallmarks of a police state. Even statistics do not back up the need for more restrictive gun control. According to Stats Canada in 2017, guns were used in only 0.066% of the time in violent crime. That means that 99.933% of the times, guns were not used in the commission of a violent crime. If you want to stop drunk drivers, you take the cars away from all the sober drivers? No, this is utter nonsense. You have to understand that the end game of the Trudeau and the Liberal Firearms Act has nothing to do with stopping criminals and gangs. It is about taking guns away from the Canadian citizens. It is all about confiscation. When you understand this, then the gun grabbing laws that are passed will make sense. the Firearms Act is built on a confiscation agenda. Any sensible person knows that imposing more laws on legal gun owners will not stop criminals. As I keep saying, this bill is not about stopping criminals. After New Zealand announced the start of a major firearms confiscation program, the gangs in New Zealand have publicly stated in local press that they have no intentions of obeying further gun controls. Are you going to think it's any different here? More laws for legal gun owners will create overnight criminals of legal gun owners. I assert that we, the legal gun owners of Canada, are not the problem. As if this is not going to cause enough trouble, Trudeau is going to push through bans similar to what is happening in New Zealand. The Prime Minister of New Zealand has enacted sweeping new bans that will include semi-auto rifles, pump-action shotguns. And how does this affect us? Justin Trudeau wants to follow their example. New Zealand, with their ban, and Justin following suit. Now, if you don't think he can do it, think again. He can. The regulatory framework of the Firearms Act allows him to. Justin is going to use something called an order in council. An OIC does not have to be approved by Parliament, just signed by the Governor and Council, and he can change almost any regulation in the Firearms Act. This could also include who holds a valid firearms license. Think about that for a second. Changed by an OIC, no debate. We know that Justin is looking to New Zealand as an example of what to do, and now he is creating the Chinese example of a basic dictatorship he so loves and admires. Along with gun owners, shooting ranges are in the crosshairs for unnecessary regulation as well. I have been receiving reports that the Chief Firearms Officer has been demanding that all membership information is to be handed over to the CFO. This includes a member's name, address, phone number, date of birth, and license information. This is happening when the range license is up for renewal and the ranges are being threatened with denial of renewal if this information is not supplied. This is a tactic to shut down ranges and make it harder for gun owners to comply with regulations. Ranges are private businesses that should not be forced to hand over sensitive personal information to government bureaucrats. Under Section 58 of the Firearms Act, the CFOs are abusing broad powers that include the ability to make policies backed by law and threats of confiscation. I have a letter confirming this. The CFO rule for restricted license holders of needing to have a range membership to possess a restricted firearm is not law, but a CFO policy. How many have a restricted license here? Okay, that little piece where the CFO says you need a range membership or we're not going to renew your license, that's not law. Nowhere in the Firearms Act does it state that that is a prerequisite for possessing a restricted firearm. Now, if you don't get a range membership, the registration certificate for your firearm will be revoked, and I quote, "You will be required to legally dispose of your firearms," end quote. That's from the letter that I received. This is another form of confiscation. Because of these kinds of regulations by unelected bureaucrats, the Firearms Act must be repealed. To do this, Justin Trudeau has to be stopped. If we do not vote him out in October, he will be emboldened to continue and accelerate his attacks on our rights and freedoms. Historically, the loss of rights and freedoms is preceded by large-scale gun confiscations. Keep that in mind. So wake up, people. It's happening right now as we sit here. So what can we do to fight them? Find out who your best local candidate is. Get out there and help them by donating time, energy, and money if you're able, okay? Help us at the Firearms Institute for Rational Education to educate and train people about this kind of thing. help defeat the Trudeau Liberals. We need to push back and push back hard. In Morton Blackwell's Laws of the Public Policy Process, rule number 38 states, in politics, nothing moves unless it is pushed. And we need to push Justin Trudeau out the door. Thank you. We also have petitions circulating here. If you could sign them, it would help us out a great deal. Also, if you could make a donation to help pay for the time, effort, and expense of going into putting on this this little do that we've got going here, it would be much appreciated as well. Thanks for your time, guys.
Thank you very much, Todd.
Oh, I had to pay you double whatever I'm paying you now. Well, first off, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank Carl for putting this together. I know he's had a jar that I saw at the beginning here. I often, tell people, if you think this was as worthwhile as going to the movies, if you learned as much, if you found it as interesting and stimulating, please think about what you pay to go to the movies and how much that brings you as value in your life. And if you think this is equally as valuable, if not more valuable, think of it, funding it like you would Hollywood, right? $20 or whatever. So what I want to talk about today is gun rights are human rights. A government that disarms law-abiding citizens does not trust law-abiding citizens. When a government does not trust decent people with guns, decent people can no longer trust their government. I'm going to show you a picture of George Orwell. And he's famous for writing 1984 and Animal Farm and a whole bunch of other political tracts. George Orwell wrote that a rifle on the wall of a laborer's cottage or working class flat is the symbol of democracy. It is our job to see that it stays there. When power corrupts, liberty is destroyed. The people are the heart, soul, and substance of a nation. They must have the right to defend their own lives, land, and families from any enemy. Every tyrant has known that in order to subjugate a people, those people must be disarmed. A house is like a castle when its occupants are armed. And I think if you move to that next slide, there was a famous English jurist who said that, basically the castle defense in English law, it goes back even to Cicero of the Roman Empire, but I thought because of Canada's history, would stick at least with the English in the 16th century. History is full of examples of governments disarming their citizens with the promise that they will be protected by the state, only to be brutally betrayed. The ancient Eastern martial arts are, almost without exception, the creations of people who were deprived of their weapons. Kung Fu, karate, judo, and so many more systems of self-defense were created by people desperate to defend their homes and families from tyrannical governments. Next slide, please. So in 1866, the Ottoman Empire enacted Article 166 of its penal code. That was followed up with a proclamation in 1911. The government of the day required people to have permits in order to own guns. The government established a list of gun owners and banned possession without a permit. From 1915 until 1917, 1.5 million Armenians, mostly Christians, were slaughtered. Next slide, please. In 1918, one of the first resolutions passed by Lenin in the Soviet Union allowed guns for the Bolsheviks in exclusion of everybody else. That was followed by the decree of July 20th in 1920. And then in 1926 came Articles 59 and 182 of the Penal Code. The Bolsheviks brought in the licensing of gun owners. They banned the possession of guns by others and enacted severe penalties for those who disobeyed. All power to the Soviets, they said. Between 1929 and 1953, 20 million political dissidents and farming communities who opposed collectivization perished. Next slide, please. In 1928, the Weimar Republic brought in new laws on firearms and ammunition. The National Socialist German Workers' Party enacted a weapon law on March 18, 1938, followed up by regulations specific to Jews. The rationale was registration and licensing, stricter handgun laws, and a ban on possession without proper documentation. Between 1933 and 1945, 20 million political opponents, Jews, gypsies, and critics were made examples of. Next slide, please. In 1914, nationalist China brought in Article 205 of their criminal code. In 1935, that was followed up by the Articles 186 and 187 of the criminal code. The stated objectives were a government permit system and a ban on private ownership. Between 1927 and 1949, 10 million political opponents and army conscripts and others died. This photo that you see here was known as the Shanghai Massacre. There were many massacres, but this was one of the ones that was best covered in newspapers in the West. Next slide, please. Not to be outdone, in 1951, Mao Zedong brought in the Act of February 20th. The Red Chinese followed up in 1957 with the Act of October 22nd. The new gun laws meant prison or death for counter-revolutionary criminals and anyone resisting any government program. There was also a death penalty for supplying guns to such criminals. Between 1949 and 1976, 35 million political opponents, rural peasants, and enemies of the state were executed. Communist China to this day executes more people than the rest of the entire world combined. Justin Trudeau admires how China can get things done. Think about that. Think about that. And his father was also a big fan. All right, next slide. In 1932, Guatemala enacted Decree 36 on November 25th. In 1947, they followed up with Decree 386. Finally, in 1964 came Decree 283. Guatemala registered guns and owners. They brought in licensing with high fees. They prohibited the carrying of guns. They banned guns and sharp tools. The government also granted itself confiscation powers. Between 1960 and 1981, up to 200,000 Mayans, other Indians, and political enemies were eliminated. Next slide, please. In 1955, Uganda enacted a firearms ordinance. In 1970, Idi Amin followed that up with a Firearms Act. Doesn't that sound familiar? The dictator required all guns and their owners, all guns and their owners. He imposed licenses for transactions. Doesn't that sound familiar, right? Backdoor registry. He created warrantless searches and confiscation powers. Between 1971 and 1979, 300,000 Christians were put to death. Next slide. In 1938, Cambodia enacted Articles 322 to 328 of their penal code, along with Royal Ordinance 55. Licenses for guns, owners, ammunition, and transactions were brought in. There was a requirement for voter identification with fingerprints and licenses that were inspected every 3 months. Between 1975, timing, eh? Between 1975, okay, let's hope that doesn't ring again. Between 1975 and 1979, Pol Pot killed 2 million intellectuals and political enemies. Next slide. In 1979, Rwanda enacted Decree Law Number 12. They registered guns, owners, and ammunition. Owners had to justify a need to own. Concealable guns were made illegal, along with new confiscation powers for the state. In 1994, 800,000 Tutsi people were massacred. Next slide. In 2012, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela brought in new gun laws to deal with a rise in violent crime. Heard that before, right? Citizens already had to have a state permit to purchase firearms. The firearms industry was nationalized, taken over by the state. His new law did away with citizen firearm permits. Only state-sponsored groups could access firearms. Nicolas Maduro, the chosen successor, who's now the ruler, has forced starvation upon his people and ordered the military to open fire on those accepting foreign food aid. Armed pro-government groups called colectivos have attacked demonstrations attended by thousands of protesters and staged violent raids on apartment buildings. 357 security officers were under investigation for extrajudicial killings. 12,500 people have been arrested, and 3 million of Venezuela's 32 million people have fled their country since 2014. Justin Trudeau actually praised Venezuela for her starving people being so slim. You remember that? Actually commented about, oh, they all look so fit and slim. They're starving to death. Okay? Think about that. Think about that. In the 20th century alone, evil governments wiped out 170 million innocent non-military lives. Governments murdered 4 times as many civilians as were killed in all the international and domestic wars combined. Governments murdered millions more people than were killed by common criminals. Gun control, my friends, is population control. Responsible gun ownership is the duty of every qualified and capable citizen. I was very heartened today to hear that some people who don't have licenses are going to get them and are going to buy some firearms, because let me tell you folks, it is an important freedom, and it is the one that guarantees the others. It is very important. When you think about the right to free speech, the right of assembly, the right of freedom of religion, if you do not have firearms, how do you protect those things? Anyhow, thank you very much for your time, and I don't know if we have a chance for questions. Carl mentioned you might want to do that. I don't know if people have questions. I also wanted to mention and tell you a little bit about the petition that we have. Right now, the Firearms Act is administered by Ottawa without any provincial input. When it was brought in here in Alberta, Ralph Klein wanted nothing to do with it. I understand why. He saw it as a federal program, there was an intrusion area, and didn't want to touch it. The result, therefore, though, is that the Chief Firearms Officer of Alberta is appointed by Justin Trudeau. Okay? I think, at bare minimum, they should be chosen by us. And when I mean chosen by us, I don't mean chosen by the Premier. Okay? I don't mean chosen by the RCMP. Okay? I don't mean chosen by the Cabinet or by the Justice Minister or the Attorney General. This petition is that Alberta firearms license holders should elect the Chief Firearms Officer for Alberta. So for those of you who hold licenses in the province of Alberta, okay, you're the ones who should be able to elect who your Chief Firearms Officer is. Okay, that's our position. That's something we've articulated to the various provincial parties, and something we want to see implemented. And I think you'd agree, given the scenario and how very important this issue is, that it's in your hands and not those of the few, that in a sense the many have a chance to vote on this. Anyhow, that's the petition, and I don't know, Carl, I turn it over to you, whatever you want to do.
Does anyone has any question here? Well, that's me.
Okay, you're going to get the microphone.
You betcha, right now.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the success of petitions. I know that there's lots forwarded every week from different organizations, different causes. Have you ever seen one succeed within our government?
Is it on? Hold on. Can you hear me? Is this on? Good, okay. They do succeed, ma'am, and I'll tell you, I'll give you some background on that. First off, a lot of times when you see a petition, they have to have at least 25 signatories, okay? So what happens is a lot of people read that, and they think what they're going to do is put together a petition, scrunch up the wording really small so that the elderly can't read it. They have to squint, and they say, what's this all about? And then you have to fill in 25 names all on one page. Well, if you do that, the clerk of the House of Commons has to check to make sure you're real people, that you're not Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck or something like that. And so as a result, when you do it that way, it makes it hard for people to read. And there's also literally no information on that for them to check who the individual is. So if somebody writes in chicken scratch, you can't verify this stuff. I'll tell you a sad story just to make the point of how a bad petition is done. I had a bunch of Vietnamese freedom fighters, South Vietnamese, who came to me very troubled about what was happening with the Spratly Islands, where China was encroaching upon the Vietnamese possessions, and the Canadian government, they wanted to have stand up for the territorial integrity of Vietnam. They presented me a petition with over 3,000 signatures. Can you believe that out of those over 3,000 signatures, I could not present it in the House of Commons, not because the preamble wasn't correct, but because it was all chicken scratch, and the clerk could not make out the names. I couldn't present it. How sad is that? By the flip side, okay, I just talked about this issue in Venezuela. I have a number of friends of mine who are Venezuelans that are here as refugees escaping the socialist government, communist government of Maduro. I sat down in my basement, and Todd knows I've done this with him on a few occasions with some of our petitions. I sat down, crafted a petition. The way I do it is that I want to make the print large so everybody can read it. I want to make it tight. I don't want to ramble. I want to bold the key words so that it's easier for everybody to understand, so they don't have to read the whole thing. They can just scan for the keywords. Down below, where people fill out their names, I say please print, okay, because I want to make it legible. And we give them all sorts of options there in terms of their background, right? Like the petition only requires that there's a signature, the province, and the city. Okay. The problem is though, if I have a bad signature, let's say my name is John Smith, how do I verify which John Smith? It's useless. Okay. But if I allow them to put in John Smith, address, Calgary, Alberta, postal code, phone number, email, etc., with signature, now we can figure out whether or not it's a real person. So that helps. In the case of this Venezuela situation, Venezuela was laundering a lot of money, and the crooked people, the corrupt people in their regime, were sending their kids and their fortunes overseas. And so I structured a petition in my basement about how we were going to, in a sense, block the assets, like we did with the Russians over the invasion in Ukraine and Crimea. We were going to seize their bank accounts unless they removed themselves from Ukraine. I structured a petition similar to that with regard to Venezuela, and we got it signed by hundreds and thousands of Venezuelans across Canada. And by golly, they did it. We listed through a number of the organizations, the people that were involved, etc., and the government, and I have to give credit to the Minister, Chrystia Freeland, on this. I disagree with her on some things, I agree with her on others. On this one, I would have agreed with her. They went ahead and they seized the assets of the Venezuelan banks and those people who were involved with laundering and sending that corrupt money overseas. So does it work? Sure. You have to be smart about how you do it. You have to think about something that's tangible, okay? You have to think about something that's accomplishable, that is bite-sized, that is relatively easy to do and execute. Okay, so there's a certain art, if you will, to crafting a petition. As well, when you present them in the House of Commons, the best way to do it is to not take, in this case of these Vietnamese who I knew, and give me singly 3,000 petitions to present. No, no, no. If you're required to submit them 25 people at a time, take these, where they're one person, okay, put them in bundles of 30, so that way when the clerk checks them, we're likely to find 25 valid signatures, and then have me, for example, okay, stand up and present it. You can have Laura Lynn or whoever, okay, all of these various politicians. The more you can get, I could have one person present a petition on behalf of 3,000 people, okay, or I could have 30 politicians or 300 politicians present on behalf of smaller segments. And what it does is it educates each office, each member, each sitting where they do the presentations about the issue. Okay, all of that helps. And then you get all those letters, that are flooding in from the clerk's office to the given minister or committee that has to deal with these issues. So I know that was a long-winded explanation. Did it help?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, can you hazard a guess on the success rate for petitions? 80%, 20%?
You know what I would say to that? I would say it comes down to you. It comes down to the people who sign the petitions, and it comes down to the people who draft them. Let me give you an example, because I think many of us would be social conservatives in the room who attend church, despite the fact this is on a Sunday, so we might be doing this instead of a church today, I don't know. Okay, but in the 1980s, 1 million people, over 1 million people signed a petition in this country that said they wanted to see an end or a reduction or a restriction on abortion, okay? And it was the largest petition gathered in Canadian history. When there was a petition to defend traditional marriage, you're talking 300,000 that signed that petition. Okay, so this is a big petition, and it happened, a couple decades before that one did. They failed to database it. They never bothered, the pro-life organizations never bothered to record who signed the petition. As a result, okay, you couldn't mobilize them for phone calls, okay, or for emails, or for letters, or for visitations with their members of parliament, etc. So what happened was, it got filed in the House of Commons, the government wrote back a perfunctory letter about thank you for your petition, and that was it, and it was done. Had they databased that, and turned that into a 300-pound gorilla of an organization on pro-life causes, it would be the biggest, baddest, third-party advocacy group in this country, that if it said to any politician, I want you to do this, politicians would say, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, how high should I jump? So it comes down to the effectiveness of the people writing the petition and following up on it, okay? I structured a petition literally months ago, and Todd might remember this, in my basement on Venezuela, and we got their accounts seized. We got their assets frozen, okay? It comes down to how clever you are about how you do it, how you mobilize.
Can I make a comment on it too?
Yes, sir.
You can hear me. This particular petition, who asked the question? Oh, it was you. Okay. There we go. Is it on? Nope, it's not on. No. Anyway, I can talk about that. This particular petition has several reasons behind it. The first one is I am actually drafting policies for different parties on the same agenda as this petition. So what this petition is doing first is showing support for the policy. So I can go into a political party, into the back room, and say, here's a good policy, and here's a stack of petitions showing people that support it outside of the party, potential voters. Okay, so that helps get these kind of good policies into the political parties, and I've done that for what, 3 provincial parties, and a couple of federal ones as well. The second thing that it's going to do is once that party that has adopted that policy, I'm not going to give them the petitions at that point. I am going to hold their feet to the fire, saying, okay, here's all these people that supported it. Now we need to do something with it. So those are the 2 biggest reasons that I use it, and they mesh in exactly with what Rob was saying. It depends on who you are, what you're doing with it, and how badly you want to push it. Does that help out?
I'd also follow up saying this, that when an MP stands up in the House of Commons and presents a petition, whether it's on Venezuela or guns or abortion or what have you, I would like to take the clip of that, okay, and put it on YouTube, post it, put it on a blog, put it on a website, etc. Let the people who are supportive of your organization know that there's politicians who are speaking these issues, and that them filling out the petition matters, and that it's actually getting read in Parliament, in the legislature, etc., affecting policy. Right? So there's various ways that you can make this more effective. Any other yes? Hello, question?
I just wanted to quickly clarify. First of all, we have my group, the group of people that work with me and that I work with them. We are in the process right now. We have collected hundreds of signatures on a petition right now. We're talking hundreds, maybe thousands. We weren't sure exactly what to do with them, and if I just heard you correctly, you're saying it's better to separate those out and give it to multiple MPs to present it instead of one? Is that correct?
Yeah, I would think so, sir. For example, you could hand. I'll give you another example. I was for a long time, because of some of these issues I've highlighted in my speech, a big supporter of freedom and democracy and human rights in China. and I've represented the Tibetans and the Falun Gong and democracy folks in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and all sorts of these issues that have issues with the Communist Party of China. Well, the Tibetans, whom I have a long relationship with, at one point visited me in my office and gave me thousands, literally, of petitions. And they didn't want to take the time, because they were busy, you know, they've got lives, they've got other things to do, they're, you know, busy working at airlines or fundraising for the university or this, that, and the other thing, other jobs. They gave them to me, the whole stack of them, and they said, can you distribute these to some of your fellow colleagues, your politicians? And I told them, I said, that's a mistake. Of course, I'll try and do it on your behalf, etc. I said, but the value in what you're doing is when you sit down with me and you give me a stack of petitions for me to present, I'm learning about your issue. Now, I already know the Tibetan issue fairly well, okay? But there's always room to learn. I always learn. In sitting down with the other colleagues that I have in Calgary, another 7 of them, okay, they could have had the opportunity to educate each of them about what's going on. Maybe the super train that's being built across Tibet to move the People's Liberation Army to suppress a revolt, maybe about the Panchen Lama who's been kidnapped and held by the Chinese to brainwash him, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's always opportunities to educate these other politicians. It's better than Rob Anders just going to a caucus colleague in Calgary and saying, hey, by the way, here's 50 or 100 petitions on behalf of the Tibetans. Would you mind getting up and presenting them? You have a unique opportunity with every single one of them to educate them, to get a sense, to meet with them face to face, to judge by their body language. Do they care? Are they just going through the motions? Are they a true believer? What makes them tick? Okay, that's valuable. That's a valuable part of the process of being an advocate for a given issue.
So you're saying the best way would be then to approach those people directly?
Absolutely.
And educate them prior to having them go over this?
Absolutely. Let's say you had 300 petitions, just to pick a number. Okay, you could present 300 petitions to one politician, and they could go. But when they do it, that's only going to be 60 seconds where they get up in the House of Commons and talk to that issue, and that's it. But if I break it down into 10 groupings of 30 petitions each, and I give that to 10 different politicians, and each of them gives a 1-minute speech or statement on the presentation of the petitions, wow, well, that's taken up 10 times as much time in the House of Commons. It's educated 9 other politicians about the issue. It's not only educated them, but their staffs about the issue, okay? And it's maybe educated more of the other parliamentarians that are sitting and listening to those petitions being presented, right? So it's a question of, do you want to have one voice or do you want to have many? Todd and I talk about this, and Karen and others, with regard to gun rights, okay? I'm a lifetime member of the National Firearms Association, the National Rifle Association in the United States, okay? I support Gunners of America and all these different gun groups, okay? I love the idea that there are multiple voices on these issues. Can you imagine if there was only but one voice in the wilderness? How lonely and sad that would be. And when that was the case in the United States with the NRA, okay, they slowly but surely, even if you win 90 or 80% of the battles, you still lose 10 or 20%, and you constantly lose ground, and freedom and liberty gets eroded. But if I have 10 groups or 100 groups articulating on behalf of a given cause who sometimes or sometimes don't coordinate, I have that many more voices in the field. Does that make sense, sir?
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
you have that sheet of yours of how to have an effective petition that anyone could.
Oh yeah, we do have a sheet. Karen mentions about how to draft a better petition, etc. We don't have it with us right now, but Todd can get you copies. He's got cards, and he can get that to you if you wish.
Actually, can I say something to Todd? Rob Andrews, now that he's retired, he actually does training sessions for anyone that has anything in activism, whether it's campaigning or petition writing. He gladly educates and shares information on how to do this. So he has to recap what he said, is you want to keep to the point, you want to bold those lines, you want it to be simple, and you want people to write legibly, and you only need 25 signatures for somebody to take it into the House. So you can learn more and contact him if any groups need help for how to be effective.
I'm always willing to help a good issue, and there's lots of good issues out
He
there.
really is. He really
Yeah.
is.
If that's it, let's see any other questions. thank you, God bless you, thank you very much for your time, for being here today, for caring, and trying to make Alberta and Canada a better place. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robert Joan Handers.
Anyways. My name is Benjamin Dichter. I am a candidate of record for the Conservative Party of Canada. In my mind, a troubled Conservative Party of Canada, which hopefully we can rectify soon. And I'm also the co-creator and producer of the Quiggin Report and a few other podcasts you may or may not know of. Tom Quiggin is probably one of the most fascinating people I've ever met. Does everybody here listen to the Quiggin Report, or the people who don't listen? Who listens? Raise your hand. Oh, you got a few people. So for those of you who don't know, Tom is a virtual celebrity in the global intelligence world. He has had many positions both in the military and within government, with a number of institutions you may be familiar with. I'll give you a few names of them. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Bank of Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces, the United Nations Protection Force in Yugoslavia, Citizenship and Immigration Canada War Crimes, International War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, The Hague, Privy Council Office of Canada. He was an arms control inspector for the conventional forces in Europe Treaty and the Vienna Document. He's testified in the Air India inquiry. He is a court-qualified expert on terrorism in criminal and federal court, and intelligence collection and evidence in federal court. He's testified multiple times in both the House of Commons and in the Royal Commission Air India inquiry. But the other day, or should I say a few days before we left Toronto, Tom did an interview with somebody by the name of Mike Bullard. And Mike Bullard brought up a description that was quite succinct. He said, you know, Tom, you sound like Canada's real-life Jack Ryan. And it's very true. If those of you who have seen any of the Jack Ryan videos or read the books, the one that sticks in my mind is The Hunt for Red October. And there's a scene where they're lowering Jack Ryan onto the Red October submarine from a Sea King helicopter. Both the people in that shot are Tom Quiggin. He was a Sea King guy when he was in the military when he was younger, and he was the intelligence analyst when he came of age and went into this field of study. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Quiggin.
Good afternoon, and thanks for all of you being here. One of the things we've been talking a lot about on this tour is free speech, and it was interesting to see the issue of gun rights come up today, because it's all sort of tied together at the end of the day. I tell people, at the end of the day, free speech might be your most important right, because without them, the rest of them disappear. And then there's the question, of course, is how do you enforce free speech? And it's an interesting question. If you don't have the power and the will to enforce free speech, it doesn't matter. Normally when I ask people, like, what do you think your most important right is? As individuals, we'll come back to the idea of just being alive. I have the right to not be murdered. That's my basic human right. But the reality is, as a society, we can afford to lose a few people here and there. But if we lose free speech and we lose the right to defend it, everything else goes with it and it's gone. So this is part of the reason why we're doing this this tour, and part of this discussion is to talk about free speech. Because we don't have it, everything else goes. So what I'm going to do today, just to talk about some of the stuff that's going on in Canada, is that we're going to explain a bit about what's going on in Canada and around the world. You see terrorist attacks going everywhere, and it's like, what? What's going on? What's happening? And what's happening is actually political Islam. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the effects in Canada, the so-called Red-Green Alliance. Why is it people like Justin Trudeau of the Liberal Party, Red, are so willing to work with folks who are Islamists, the Green vote? Talk a bit about silencing free speech. We're going to talk about a bit about the pushback. As much as there is a massive amount of really negative news in the world right now, there's actually a few good things going on too, and we should focus on that. And we're going to talk about Operation Kill Switch, what's going on here. Now, One thing I wasn't going to talk about when we started this tour and got ready for it was the Member of Parliament, a fellow by the name of Mr. Cooper from just up the road here in Edmonton, Michael Cooper. You may recall he's made the news. Mr. Scheer, the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, chucked him off the Justice Committee, forced him to apologize, and then basically kind of threw him under the bus. And I got to tell you, I was a little bit shocked to see any party leader throw one of his own members of parliament under the bus, especially this close to an election. So why did MP Michael Cooper get chucked under the bus? And my observation is this: he had the temerity, the absolute brazenness to speak truth during a parliamentary session. And that's not something that's appreciated a lot right now. So what happened? There's a bit of parliamentary meeting going on. MPs are talking, guests are invited in to present on certain issues. So in comes this one Muslim gentleman, and he says, look, the problem right now with violence, the problem with terrorism, the reason we had the attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, is because of conservative commentators. You know, they're getting people angry, and that's what causes the violence. So Mr. Cooper, the Member of Parliament, actually says, well, look, you know, maybe it's a bit different than that. And he had the manifesto with him that was written by the guy that shot all the Muslims in their mosque in New Zealand. He has this manifesto. Now, what's interesting is what you are told is that guy was some kind of right-wing wacko. He's a white supremacist, and, you know, conservative commentators are causing this problem. Well, I would invite you to read the manifesto. You can find it on the internet, which you can do legally in Canada, which you can't do in New Zealand. You can be jailed in New Zealand for sharing the video, sharing the manifesto, believe it or not. That's how bad things are somewhere. I would encourage you to read it. Now, the guy who did the shooting explained why he did it. And to be quite clear, on one side of the document, it is a white supremacist document. He talks about the white race, the European race, the need to establish the power, etc. So when people go, well, that guy was some kind of white supremacist, the answer is, yes, he was. It's completely true. The other interesting thing, though, is he talks about conservatism. And he says, look, conservatism has conserved nothing. It should be taken out and buried. He literally says conservatism should be buried. And then he says, well, who do I admire? He says, I admire Red China. So if he's supposed to be a right-wing nutbar, why is it that he supports a communist government in China? And that was Mr. Cooper's sin, if you will. So the narrative that Ottawa is pushing, the narrative that Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Goodale, Ms. Freeland are pushing is white supremacy, right-wing Christian nutbars are the issue. They are the problem. But when Mr. Cooper stands up and correctly points out that, in fact, this guy is an admirer of communist China who says conservatism should be buried, well, he is going against the official narrative. And in politics and in Ottawa right now, that is the single most grievous sin. He'd have been better to get up and throw up on the table than he would to have said that. So that's why Mr. Cooper is in trouble. It's for basically speaking truth on a very sensitive and awkward subject. Why Mr. Scheer chose to throw him under the bus, I really don't know. Ask the question to Mr. Scheer, I can't answer it. So anyway, just that's off a little bit off track. So now let's get back on track here. Some of you probably have noticed there's a few things going on in the world. There was a terrorist attack in Edmonton. There was one in Ottawa. Mr. Aaron Driver of London, Ontario tried to become a suicide bomber and blew up his taxi, but that was it. And then there's been attacks in the city of London, the city of Manchester. We had multiple attacks in Paris and in Nice and in Brussels. We have had attacks in America. There's been attacks in India. We just had the major attack against a group of Christians in Sri Lanka carried out by an Islamist group. So it's a fairly fair observation to say that something is going on in the world right now where people who identify with the religion of Islam are blowing up a lot of stuff, killing a lot of people, driving people to death on the streets, hitting them with their cars, etc. So the question, it's a fair question, what the heck is going on? People ask me, like, what are these guys up to? What's going on? So here's the answer. In brief, there is the religion of Islam. It's a faith. There's about 1.5 billion people in the world who would self-identify as Muslims. You can break them into many different categories, just like you can break Christianity into many different categories. One way of doing it, though, is to break them into two groups. They're a group of Muslims, such as some of the ones like here in Canada with Muslims Facing Tomorrow, whatever, who want to take Islam as a religion, and they want to take themselves as Muslims and weld onto their religion some human rights, some basic science, some basic technology, and drive the faith into the future. In short, they want to modernize Islam and do something positive with it. So that's one whole group of people here in Canada, America, and literally around the world. Over here on the other side, however, you've got a different group of people. They want to take Islam and convert it into a political force. They talk about political Islam, and the sort of buzzword we use for that is Islamists. Not just someone who's Muslim or Islam, but they're an Islamist, and that's sort of the code word for they want political Islam. And by political Islam, we mean it will be the government, it will be the law, it will be the social services, it will be the healthcare system, it will be how your children are educated in school, it will be how your finances are run, it's how you get your mortgage. In other words, everything in the life of people will be controlled by Islam. So this is what they're trying to do, and it sounds like kind of a crazy project. You think, well, you know, how do you hope to take over the world with this? Well, let me just point this out. Right now, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the largest of the Islamist groups, is operating in 81 countries around the world. They have cultural centers, mosques, churches, schools, libraries. They have federally funded charities in countries like Canada, and they are actually being very effective. Your federal government, right now in Ottawa, has people in it who identify with the Islamist cause. That is why they are there. So the question sort of becomes, if this political Islam is spreading around the world, it's spreading through South Asia, through Africa, through Europe, through Canada, through America, what is the effect of political Islam? Well, we see a bunch of different kinds of effects. One is there are people in political Islam who think violence is the answer. The best way to get your message out there, the best way to cow people into submission is to bomb them or hit them with your vehicle or to shoot them or whatever. So when you see the terrorist attack against the Ariana Grande conference in Manchester, that was one of these guys. The attack in Edmonton with the vehicle, one of those guys. The guy that shot up Parliament Hill, one of those guys. So that's one effect. The other effect is political entryism. Now what does that mean? That's just a fancy political science word. And what it means is some folks go out and join a political party because they want to support the party or because they like the leader or they want to get involved. Other folks join a party and then they say, once we're in the party, we'll volunteer, we'll donate money, we'll bring in members, and then we'll change the direction of the party so we can take it over and do what we want with it. So the Liberal Party right now has a political entryism problem. Iqra Khalid is one example. The member of parliament from Mississauga, Iqra Khalid, is the person who brought us the M103 anti-Islamophobia motion, which is a blatant and clear attempt to silence free speech about political Islam. So why is it I can stand up and I can criticize Jews, I can criticize Christians, I can criticize Hindus, I can criticize Buddhists, Maoists, just about anything else going of any political stripe or any faith. But as soon as I talk about Islam, all of a sudden, oh, that's racist, that's Islamophobic. It's like, why the two standards? Why do we need two standards? Why are people worried about this? There's a very simple answer to the question, and that is the values that political Islam wants to bring to Canada are so abhorrent that if you understood them and knew what they were about, you wouldn't want them. So instead, the approach that is being brought is you're just not allowed to talk about it, period. Same thing in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Denmark, etc. The same problem is going on everywhere. So that's political entryism. Now, just as a qualifier, let me say this. The Liberals are the worst, no doubt. But the NDP and the Conservative Party are in the same boat. They're moving in the same direction. So if you think that somehow the Conservative Party has inoculated itself against this problem, or that's like a Liberal problem, or the Dippers have that problem, the reality is we see the exact same process going on in the Conservative Party now. I would argue the Liberals are the worst at it, they have the biggest problem, but the fact is all three of the mainstream parties are moving in that direction, and in that sense there's no actual difference between them. There's also a lot of terrorism fundraising going on here in Canada. There was a group called Irfan, federally registered charity, took a whole bunch of taxpayers' money, about $35 million, sent it to Hamas. They eventually got busted by CRA and got shut down, but it still goes on. There's a bunch of other groups doing it. And in addition to that, $160 million of your taxpayers' money went directly to something called UNRWA. It is a supposedly United Nations operation in the Palestinian territories, but it's controlled by Hamas, and we just gave them $160 million over the last 3 years. So $160 million of your taxpayers' money went to fund Hamas directly, done by the government of Canada. We'll talk more about that. Now, Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, Liberal leader Trudeau, the Honorable Justin Trudeau, the Islamist cause. What is this guy on about? You hear him say some of the craziest stuff going. So he stood up and said he supports the return of ISIS fighters to Canada because they will be a powerful voice for de-radicalization. Quick thought here. The government of Canada doesn't actually have a de-radicalization program, but just kind of forget that for a moment. He actually believes that people who commit genocide, people who've committed massive terrorist acts, people who commit mass rape and mass murder, when they return to Canada, somehow they're going to be useful because they'll tell people, oh, you know, we shouldn't really do this. Well, it's utter nonsense. Now, here's the other thing. He also told you that if you think that's a bad idea, if you were opposed to the idea of bringing terrorists and people who commit genocide back to Canada so you can pay to bring them home, etc., if you're opposed to that, it's because you're Islamophobic. And I thought, I'm ex-military, I've been to a war, I've seen what people can do, I've seen how bad it is when things come apart in places like Bosnia, Croatia. I've seen what a concentration camp looks like. I work for the War Crimes Tribunal. Human beings can do some really horrible crap to each other, and ISIS is probably the worst of a bad bunch so far this century. But yet, if I'm afraid of them, it's not because I'm smart, because I know what these guys can do. It's not because I'm, I don't want to be shot by one of these guys. It's I'm Islamophobic. It's like it's got nothing to do with Islamophobia. It's got everything to do with these are bad people. But Mr. Trudeau, since he was elected in 2008, every time he's come to a fork in the road and he's had to support Canadian values or have to support the Islamist values, he's gone with the Islamist every single time, one exception. Last June 12th, he promised to the Parliament he would list the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist force, which he hasn't done. He might still do it, so that's the one exception. Now, let me just talk a bit about the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. So, and Senate testimony, which is in Hansard, you can look it up online, it's there, everybody can read it. It's been testified to in the Senate of Canada that the Muslim Brotherhood has about 8 to 10 different front groups here operating in Canada. The 4 biggest ones, the 4 ones best known, are Islamic Relief Canada, which is a federally registered charity, which means you're helping to pay for it. There is the National Council of Canadian Muslims operating out of Ottawa, the Muslim Association of Canada, which runs schools and mosques here in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, etc. And then there's IRFAN, which was a charity paid for by you folks, but CRA had the decency to bust it as a terrorism entity and got rid of it. So that one's actually gone. Now, I keep talking a bit about this Muslim Brotherhood thing. So who are these guys? What are they on about? Well, way back in 1928, in the country of Egypt, a fellow by the name of Hassan al-Banna decided he was going to found the Ikhwani, the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. And he decided this would be a social and political organization which would be power-seeking. In other words, it's almost sort of like a political party. It wants to take power in countries, and it's done it several times. The leader of Bosnia is an ex-Brotherhood guy. The guy in Turkey right now, Erdogan, is ex-Muslim Brotherhood. The government of Egypt was run by the Brotherhood for a while. The government of Sudan was run by the Brotherhood for a while. So they have been successful. They are an Islamist, that is to say political group. They are a supremacist group, which is to say they tolerate no opposition. For them, there is their form of political Islam, and nothing else is acceptable. It's not that they disagree with other people, it's just they're unacceptable and they need to be removed or taken out of power. So, if you want to sort of take everything about the Muslim Brotherhood and figure out what it says, this one statement by Hassan al-Banna really kind of captures the whole thing. It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its law on all nations and to extend its power to the entire planet. So again, that almost sounds a bit strange, like, wow, these guys want to take over the world? Sounds a bit crazy. But like I said, the Muslim Brotherhood by itself is operating in 81 different countries, and there are people sitting in our parliament right now as members of parliament who support the Islamist cause. There are people who sit in the Conservative Party in Ontario at the provincial level who actually openly advocate for this kind of stuff. So it's not some crazy stuff going on in Lebanon, it's going on here. Now, just in case, again, there was any sort of discussion about what these guys are on about, the reality is they don't hide what they want to do. They're quite open and honest in a lot of cases. So the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood is this: Allah is our objective. The Quran is the Constitution. The Prophet Muhammad is our leader. Jihad is the way, and death for the sake of Allah is the highest of our aspirations. So these guys are open enough to actually admit what it is they want to do, and that's their mottos, okay? That's the next one. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the Red-Green Alliance, and this gets a bit complicated, but follow me here for a bit. We have folks around the world who are called socialists, or communists, or Marxists, or cultural Marxists, or there are a whole bunch of different terms for them. The left wing of the NDP kind of fits into that crowd. A few people in the Liberal Party kind of fit into that crowd. They are a collectivist group. That is to say, they think society should be run by a central authority where everybody has to do everything the same way. They don't believe in individual agency. They don't think you have the right to control your own life. They don't believe in individual human rights. They want a mass society controlled by a central government, which is essentially non-democratic in nature. So that's kind of the socialist cause. But when you look at the Islamist, strangely enough, much of their politics is the same way. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in individual human rights. They don't believe you should be allowed to think for yourself, act for yourself. They do think they should tell you how you should dress, where you should work, what you should eat, how you're allowed to work, how you should spend your money, and everything else. So they are also collectivist. Weirdly enough, the sort of socialist, communist, progressive, and currently some of the folks in the Liberal Party ideologically get along very well with these people because both of them want to destroy the sovereign state system. They don't want Canada to be a sovereign state with its own borders and its own control. They don't want individual human rights. They don't want women who have rights. They don't want women who can vote. So there is a natural alliance between these folks, even though they've got some very big differences. The other thing that's going on right now, and this is really interesting, is a lot of folks are frustrated right now, and you're probably some of them. You look at the upcoming federal election and you say, you know, you look at everything that's on offer there, you get the Liberal folks, the Conservative folks, you got the Dippers, you got Maxime Bernier's crowd, you get the Green folks, and you look at it and you kind of go, none of these guys really resonate with me, nobody's got a strong message, no one's taking a strong stand on anything. And you're starting to get frustrated with it. It's not Canada, it's not just Canada, it's not just Alberta, it's Germany, it's France, it's Belgium, it's Sweden, it's America to a certain degree, although less now. And what you've actually got is you've got a bunch of folks who are kind of globalist in orientation, who are pro-UN in orientation. Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Freeland, those kinds of folks. You've got the head of the European Union who's a complete globalist. And those folks want a globalist kind of world with the UN to have a very leading role in it. On the other hand, you've got folks who are probably mostly like in this room who are sovereigntists. They believe in Canada. They believe it's an independent state. We believe we should be able to make our own rules. We can open our border or we can close our border. We can invite folks in or we cannot invite them in. We can make our own decisions or we can tell the UN to take a hike. So what's actually happening is instead of a conservative versus liberal or left versus right confrontation, increasingly we're seeing sort of a globalist UN kind of group of people versus folks who believe in sovereignty, human rights, and individuality. And that's where the splits are occurring. But our political parties don't really represent that. I can't think of any of our political leaders in Canada right now at the provincial or municipal level who really resonate well on these issues. So that's kind of an issue. Bottom line is, when we talk about kind of who's winning, who's losing around the world, who's making good progress, the Islamists are making really good progress. And it's the same thing here in Canada. So, what do we have going on right now in Canada? We have a whole bunch of people trying to silence free speech, starting at the very top of the government, i.e. Mr. Trudeau, but going right down through a number of different areas. So, how is this stuff happening? So, for instance, just recently we had the foreign minister, Ms. Freeland, goes to the United Nations. She stands up and gives a speech with like the cameras going and everybody there, and she says, let me think of this for a second. She goes, neo-Nazis, right-wing extremists, incels, nativists, and anti-globalist people who have a tendency towards violence are the greatest threat to Canada. So white supremacists, neo-Nazis, incels, nativists, and anti-global activists are the greatest threat to Canada. And I've been doing this stuff for almost 40 years now, and I gotta tell you, my head really came up, I was shocked. It's like, there's a lot of threats to Canada, we got a lot of problems going on, but white supremacists and neo-Nazis are the greatest threat to Canada. And by the way, if you disagree with her, she's going to start calling you a racist and a white supremacist and a Nazi and all that stuff. So I kind of looked at this and thought, where is this coming from? How is she getting this information? How could she, as our foreign minister, tell people in foreign countries this is a problem? And then we get Trudeau and Goodale doing the same thing. They're telling you, white supremacists and neo-Nazis are the biggest threat. We've got to go after these guys. So I thought to myself, well, What does the government of Canada itself actually say as distinct from Mr. Trudeau or Mr. Goodale? So, if you get bored someday and you're interested, go to the Public Safety website, run by the Government of Canada, headed in this case by Mr. Ralph Goodale. They have something in there called the currently listed terrorist entities. In other words, who are the terrorist groups? And who do we say is officially a terrorist group? Now, these terrorist groups have to be a threat to Canadians, to Canada, or to Canadian interests. So if some guy in Nepal wants to blow up some guy in Kyrgyzstan, we don't care, it's not on the list, that's their problem, who cares? Only terrorist groups that are a threat to Canadians are listed by Public Safety Canada. So, if you're kind of one of those people like me that actually reads this stuff, I actually downloaded the thing, 10,500 words, and there are 55 terrorist groups listed in Canada right now. Guess how many of them are white supremacist groups?
None.
Zero. None. Not a single one. Guess how many times the word Nazi appears in a 10,500 word document?
Zero.
Never. Not in there. Guess how many times the word Christian appears? Twice. Both times as victims and targets. In other words, Christians are mentioned specifically as targets of terrorist groups, not as the perpetrators. Now, 40 of the 55 groups, when you read the description of what the group is about and what they're doing, are Islamist groups. So 70% of the terrorist groups listed in Canada who are a threat to Canadians are Islamist in orientation. Yet, our beloved leadership, Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Freeland, and Mr. Goodale, actually tell you that white supremacists and neo-Nazis are the greatest threat, even though they don't have a single group listed here in Canada. So I would say this on the public record, and I'd be willing to defend this in federal court, that Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Freeland, and Mr. Goodale are lying to the Canadian public willfully in order to distract away from an actual problem. Now, when I say that, I'm actually kind of serious because I testify in criminal court, I testify in federal court, where you have to be accurate, you have to have evidence, you have to be able to support your point of view. So everything I say here, I'm actually willing to take into the Federal Court of Canada to be cross-examined by a judge or to testify in Parliament to be cross-examined by MPs. I have no problem saying that. So, anyway, that's the public safety terrorism listing. Kind of an interesting situation that we're in on that one. Now, we also have this other thing going on called the anti-Islamophobia motion, brought to you by Ikra Khalid, which I've talked about earlier. And as I said, and I said it again, that is 100% specifically aimed at silencing criticism, not of somebody who hates Jews or Christians or whatever, but anybody who's actually willing to talk about the Islamist part of the Muslim faith. So that's an actual attempt by your government to silence criticism, and I think it is a really dangerous, bad thing. Now, here's something else that's going on about silencing free speech. In fact, it's about removing discussion altogether. I talked earlier about Michael Cooper, the member of Parliament who's in some trouble and how he got thrown off the committee and all that sort of stuff. Also, the Government of Canada has decided to go into Hansard, the official record of Parliament, where everything that is said is recorded and printed so you can go read it later. They're actually going to go in and cut out that entire discussion that involved Mr. Cooper and get rid of it. So I don't know how many people read the book 1984. Winston Smith is kind of the hero of the story, and he works for the Ministry of Truth, and his job is to cut out material and put it down the memory hole. Well, guess what? The Government of Canada is taking material out of the official record of Parliament, cutting it and putting it down the memory hole so we don't get to read it. If you try to go in and look right now and see what Member of Parliament Cooper said, as an officially elected MP speaking on the public record, his words have been removed. This is 1984, it's here, it's happening live now, which I find bizarre beyond belief. Now, here's something else that's just a little interesting that's going on. You might have heard, about 3 weeks ago or so, two fellows were arrested in Toronto, in Richmond Hill. An Iranian father and son team, and they were arrested on explosives charges, which is, kind of serious when you live in a downtown Toronto suburban sort of area. Immediately after these two characters were arrested, and I mean less than 1 hour, the Honourable Ralph Goodale puts out a statement in his role as Minister of Public Safety and says, there's no national security concern. It's a local police matter. And I was stunned. I looked at this and thought, wow, these two Iranian guys had tried to go to America. They tried to cross the border into the United States. They got stopped by US Customs and Border and got told, go back to Canada. U.S. Customs and Border was told these two idiots are being thrown out of America, and you want to take a look at them for some very serious reasons. So the RCMP and CSIS get involved because they are the two federal agencies that deal with cross-border and terrorism stuff. And the York Regional Police then went out and arrested these two clowns. So your Minister of Public Safety tells you there's no national security concern. Well, when two Iranian guys who have explosive expertise are stopped by Americans from trying to go into America, that's an international event. I don't know if you know right now, but the Americans and the Iranians are this far from going to war with each other in the Gulf right now, and it's very possible we're going to get a Gulf War. And guess what? This defines a national security event when a couple of guys coming from Canada are taking explosives into America, and they're Iranians, and there's almost an Iranian war going on. The Americans are distinctly correct to be panicked about this issue. Then he says it's a local police matter. The RCMP aren't the local police. The U.S. Customs Border are not local police. CSIS are not local police. The FBI are now involved. They're not local police. So in other words, once again, I would say this. I would go on the public record and say that the Minister of Public Safety willfully lied to the Canadian people about an issue to distract your attention away from a problem, which is political Islam. Now, it's not just that one. There was the Danforth shooting incident. Actually, where Ben actually lives on Danforth, but anyway. We actually meet in a cafe that had the window shot out, so this is kind of like a thing to me. I'm involved in assisting the families in their own investigations into this thing, and there is a bunch of stuff you're not being told about. The police are holding the report. It's been silenced for the last 6 months, and Canadian citizens are not being told about a guy who went down the street, murdered 2 young girls, injured about 12 or 14 others, and just generally shot up the town. So again, we're not being told the details. I'll just tell you one more. There was an attack last year on Parliament Hill where a fella in his car was trying to get his car through the RCMP checkpoint up onto Parliament Hill. He floored it, jumped over a curb, ran over a couple of people, chased a woman with her baby carriage. Some guy grabbed her, got out of the way. The guy wrecked the car. They grabbed the guy, got him. Great. The next day we were told there was no threat to public safety and it's not a national security matter. Well, people get run over by a car. Just to me, I don't know, that's a threat to public safety when you get run over by some nut bar in a car. The fact that he tried to run a woman down with a baby carriage, that's a threat to her public safety, I would argue. Interestingly enough, a journalist by the name of Anthony Fury tried to get information on it, and he was literally told to back off and go away. And then this is the funny part. A member of Parliament went on the public record and said, look, as a member of Parliament, I asked for information on what happened there, and he says, I was told they wouldn't tell me. So a member of Parliament, like that's his house, that's where they live, that's their thing, that's where they work, that's where they have their offices, and they're told don't ask questions about it even though someone tried to attack you. So anyway, that's pretty bad, and that's how speech is being silenced by not giving you the details that you can talk about. A couple other quick things. The digital charter. It all sounds great, it's all wonderful, there's a bunch of really good stuff in there, except for a couple of parts where it says, well, you know, people have to feel they're in a safe space when they're on the internet. It's like, why? I'm not in a safe space when I walk down the street. I'm not in a safe space anywhere. Why do I need to be a safe space in the internet? And what that means, if I say something on the internet that gets people upset, someone else can complain and say their feelings have been hurt. And now the government will be able to go to the ISP provider and fine them unless they shut me down or shut other people down. So this is a willful attempt by the government to use the law to shut down people through finding not necessarily you, but finding the internet service providers, et cetera, et cetera. It's insane. Then there's the media buyout. You've probably heard this. The government wants to take $600 million of taxpayers' money and give it to news organizations in Canada, the Toronto Star, CBC, Global News, maybe Corus Radio, whatever. But here's the catch. They get to decide who gets it. So if you are pro-government and you pump the government line, you're probably going to be okay. If you're not, you won't. Here's the problem. Most media organizations in Canada are suffering. They're having a hard time going from print media to digital media, and competition is tight, advertising revenue is down, expenses are up. So if you get $10 million in government handout money, that gives you a huge advantage for your organization. If the guy down the road doesn't get the $10 million, he's hurting. So it's like any other kind of contract. If you want to be a welder and complete for contracts on pipeline welding, not that that's happening, but if you were to compete for that, if the guy you're competing against gets a $10 million subsidy, he's going to underbid you and you're going to go out of business. Well, this is the intent of the media buyout, is to put media organizations who don't support the government out of business. And then we have lawfare. You remember Mr. Trudeau threatened to sue Mr. threatened to sue Mr. Scheer a while ago. Well, that's an extension of the Islamists. They do that all the time. They start law cases against you. They sue you for libel. They have no intention of ever winning it or going with it, but it's a way of silencing you, driving up your legal bills, and causing you a lot of trouble. I've been sued twice for this kind of stuff. The last one cost $240,000 to get it to go away finally, which we were successful, and now we've got another one going on. But we'll talk more about that later. Oh, unfortunately, when we switched the thing over from PowerPoint to Adobe, we lost the picture, but I'll just tell you this. The blue arrow is actually pointing at a sign that the British Army put out. It's a warning from the British Army that says if somebody self-identifies as a patriot, they are probably an extreme right-wing extremist, or they're a right-wing extremist. So simply these days, identifying yourself as someone who is a patriot or someone who expresses patriotism is a clear sign to the government that you are a right-wing extremist. Now, I kind of thought about that for a while and thought, what does our national anthem say? O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love. So if you sing the national anthem and you self-identify with this thing, you are an extreme right-wing person, according to the new view. That's what's actually going on. Now, okay, unfortunately we've lost the pictures, all right, but this next one is fun. Justin Trudeau, your Prime Minister, goes to Quebec and he's having a little town hall meeting with a bunch of folks, all good fun. He should be doing it, he's Prime Minister, good stuff. A woman stands up and she says, look, I don't understand what you're doing. You're increasing the migration numbers. We've gone from 150 to 250 to 350. And she goes, what is the proper level for immigration? How are we going to pay for all that? His answer was, your racism has no place here. So if you ask a reasonable question and you challenge the authority, the position, and the policy of the government, it's not that you disagree with Trudeau, it's not that you don't want to pay more taxes or something, it's simply that you're a racist. So to disagree with the government of Canada now is to be a racist. And therefore the media will then identify as you racist and you were silenced. That's how you silence people. Also, he called her intolerant. Now, interestingly enough, here's an interesting little situation. In 2014, while he was a member of Parliament, running to be Prime Minister, Mr. Justin Trudeau talked to something called Sana El Mashrek, which is a newspaper in Montreal. It's very pro-Iranian and it is very pro-Hezbollah. He told them during that interview that he would have a special immigration program that was more open to Muslims and Arabs. And I kind of thought about that and said, hang on, the guy who's running to be Prime Minister, who's already a member of Parliament, tells a specific group of people in a written publication that he will have a special immigration program for Arabs and Muslims. And I go, isn't that racist? That is a racist policy. That is a religion-based, race-based policy. So if you stand up and question him, you're the racist. But yet when he says he's going to have a special program for special groups of people, somehow that's okay. Ahmed Hussein, our Minister of Immigration, has said the same thing when you ask him about queue jumping at the border, when you talk about backups in the immigration system. It's because you're divisive. It's because you're a fearmonger. You're not a Canadian. You're not Canadian enough. So a guy from Somalia who supports our Prime Minister, who is presenting a race and religious-based immigration program, is calling Canadians who are born here here racist. And I kind of think like the discussion's gone off the rails completely. Now, unfortunately, like I said, we lost the imagery when this thing moved from PowerPoint to Adobe. I can show you the picture afterwards. It's absolutely wonderful. Picture Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, sitting in a chair with a hijab on, barefoot. She's sitting in a chair, hijab, and barefoot. She's sitting at the back of a room, like she's sitting back over in a corner just like that one. And she's looking at the photographer. She is in the Dundas Street Mosque, which is run openly by the Muslim Brotherhood. And she is sitting there waiting to speak because men speak first, women sit at the back, and women can only speak when the men are done speaking. So that's the Premier of the province of Ontario who self-identifies as a feminist, but yet she's sitting with her head covered and barefoot at the back of the room waiting for the men to get done talking. And I look at this and I just kind of go like, yeah. Now I look at it and I say, hang on. I live in the province of Ontario. I expect the Premier of the province of Ontario to sit at the front of the room. I expect the Premier to speak first. I expect to open the door for the Premier. I expect to say, Madam Premier, Mr. Premier, would you please go ahead? If Jason Kenney walked in right now, I would say, Mr. Kenney, here's the microphone, because he's a frickin' Premier of the province. But yet Kathleen Wynne, and by the way, the leader of the NDP does this as well, sits at the back of the mosque with her head covered, barefoot, and just kind of like, that is a current feminist. Where are women on this issue? I have no idea. Anyway. Yeah, then we got Jerry Butts, formerly known as the Prime Minister's chief advisor. He was the actual power behind the throne. He's the guy behind the curtain. You might remember, while he was in Western Canada, Justin Trudeau was being asked the question by a woman who used the word mankind. And he corrected her and he said, well, no, we use the word people kind. I got two problems. First one is this, we don't use the word people kind. Ezra Levant with the Rebel Media looked it up on a couple of mainstream media sources and said he could find that the word people kind had been used 9 times in the media in the last 20 years in North America. So it's not a common word. So criticizing the woman for that was a bit stupid. The other thing that happens though is Gerard Butts, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, comes out and says, the lesson to take from this joke being torqued by InfoWars and other alt-right Nazi friends of the rebel is that they're paying attention to the Prime Minister. So maybe they're paying attention, I don't know. But for criticizing the Prime Minister's use of stupid words, made-up words, and for insulting this woman in front of a whole room, apparently you are a alt-right Nazi. And as someone who's been to a concentration camp in places like Germany and the Netherlands, as somebody who understands World War II, as somebody who knows what a Nazi is, I think calling somebody a Nazi for making fun of the Prime Minister shows how incredibly much trouble our country is in, that kind of crap is allowed in the public discussion. But anyway, now, again, we lost the picture here. It's a sin. I don't know, a lot of people might remember Elizabeth May showed up at a green parade, you know, global warming, carbon tax, good, all this good stuff. Fine. She's sitting there in a Dodge Viper V10. This car, for those of you that follow this kind of stuff, is a 512 cubic inch, 8.4 liter, if you use that system, B10 engine, which according to our American friends, on a good day, flat, good weather, it gets 12 miles to the gallon. So here's my kind of problem with this. One, why is the Green Party leader driving around not in a Tesla electric car, but driving in the most gas-guzzling car you can buy in Canada today? To me, it's not the position, it's the hypocrisy. We are being told by our government, you must pay carbon tax, you must quit using fuel, even if you live in the middle of nowhere in Alberta and you've got to drive 30 miles to get to the nearest store, you shouldn't be using gasoline because you're a bad person. But yet she drives around a friggin' Viper DB10 that uses more gas than you can ever think of. Justin Trudeau flies around in a private jet to go from Ottawa to BC to go surfing and back again in a private jet, which is like the most fuel inefficient form of transportation ever invented. But we get called hypocrites, we get called climate deniers if we ask questions about this. So anyway, that just drives me nuts. Now, all of this stuff so far has been a little bit negative, it's been a little bit downward, kind of bummer sort of stuff. So let's look and say, is there happy stuff going on anywhere? Are there people starting to think? Are there people who are addressing the danger of political slam to other countries? And the answer is yes, there are, and it's only really happened in the last year. So let's go through a couple. Germany, the country of Germany. I used to write about no-go zones in Germany, so did other people. I wrote about no-go zones in the Netherlands, and I've actually been to the Netherlands and taken the no-go zones by Dutch federal police. But if you publish this and if you talk about no-go zones where the police aren't allowed to go, or they need special permission to go, or if they have to move in force when they go into special neighborhoods which are occupied by certain religions of peace, then you get called an Islamophobic and a racist for writing about it. So the discussion is silenced, no one's allowed to talk about it. Well, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who was the absolute darling of the progressive left, stood at a conference and said, look, these no-go zones are a problem, the police can't go there, we need to talk about it. And it was absolutely shocking. Not that she talked about no-go zones because they're there and everybody knows it, but the President of Germany, or the Chancellor of Germany, stood up in public and admitted things are so bad in Germany, there are no-go zones and they have to start addressing them. The progressive left lost its mind because their darling, their leader, actually countered everything they said doesn't exist. Now, In Germany, they have something called the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Sounds a bit Orwellian, but what it is, it's their national level intelligence service. Their German national level intelligence service came out about 4 weeks ago with a 40-page paper that said the rising wave of violence against Jews, the rising wave of anti-Semitism in Germany does not come from the extreme right, it comes from political Islam. And this was absolutely shocking to the Germans and to the rest of Europe. And as you might all remember, the Germans are a little sensitive about the issue. Little thing with the Holocaust, as Mr. Anders was talking about, 6 million Jews got killed, etc., etc. So the Jews are just hypersensitive about this issue, and so are the Germans. But yet the German national level state agency came out and said the problem comes from political Islam. And it's the only intelligence agency in Europe to do this so far, but it's the Germans, so it's important. Now, France, run by a guy named Macron. President Macron was married to a woman that looks like his mother, but let's ignore that. I didn't really have a lot of hope for President Macron when he was elected. He's a little squishy left. He doesn't seem to have any backbone. But yet, give the man credit. He actually stood up at a press conference with the cameras running, with the lights on him, and he was asked about the grand dialogue. They're having this huge debate in France right now. Where does the country go? What should the tax system do? What should the schools be teaching? How should transportation be organized? What about fuel taxes? So they're having this massive discussion all over France, and President Macron stood up and said, political Islam wants to secede from the Republic. And people just went like, he said it out loud. And then he said, accurately, that this is a political project masquerading as a religion. And it's like, thank you, President Macron of France, for standing up and saying, they're trying to break up the country, the folks are doing it, call themselves Muslims, but in fact it's really a political project. It is political Islam. So that's absolutely huge. Also in the Netherlands, there's something called the AIVD. It is their national level intelligence service, and they came out and said there is a threat to the Dutch government. There is a threat to the Dutch nation, and the threat comes from the education system, comes from their own education system. And they said, look, the Islamists have gotten so deep into our education system, in the public system and in the private system, that they are changing the minds of young Muslims, kids in school, K to 12, who are being taught to segregate themselves, who are being taught that they want to build a caliphate, who are being taught that they don't accept Dutch values. And the Dutch intelligence service says the problem has got so bad, it is now a threat to the existence of the Netherlands. And this is like absolutely huge that they say this out loud. They publish it on the internet, which means the Dutch government agrees with it, or at least allows it to be said. Same thing going on in Austria. The Chancellor of Austria says we need to remove political Islam from the country. South of us in America, the American White House has announced that they are going to try and find a way of listing parts of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is to say they're going to get into a head-on confrontation with the most powerful political Islam group in America. So that's great. So here in Canada, when you look at the federal level, the provincial level, the municipal level, you find nothing, not a thing. And I follow this stuff, I look for it. And I am looking for a leader in Canada right now who's actually willing to stand up and say, our European friends have a problem, maybe we should look at it. I'd be happy with that. I'd like to have a national leader stand up and say, we need to look at this issue and talk about it. Should these people be allowed to run charities? And the answer right now, here in Canada, we got nothing. But I do know there's a lot of people talking about it. There are politicians who are being asked questions. There are folks like you who are looking around saying, what the hell is going on? And the fact that we're here in this room having this discussion right now is a step forward. So moving on to the next thing, we're going to talk about, Ben's busy, talking about the next thing. We're going to talk about Operation Kill Switch, is what I've been involved in. Now, last October, I did something a bit strange. Just by way of background information, I used to work for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as an intelligence contractor. When I testified in court as a criminal expert on terrorism, I was working for the RCMP at the time. So, the RCMP knows who I am because I worked for them for 6.5 years and I testified for them in court. So I thought I'd have a bit of fun last fall. I got together a 130-page report that I wrote, and I said to the RCMP, this is an official complaint about a criminal activity in Canada. And Section 8301, Section 8004 of this of the Criminal Code of Canada is being violated. What's being violated? I said, well, several members of the government, Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Freeland, Mr. Hussan, Omar Al-Gabra, Ikrit Khalid, and Marie-Claude Bilbao, are taking Canadian taxpayers' money and sending it down a path which they know, or should know, will eventually wind up in the hands of some terrorists. And I said, that's actually a criminal act. So if I give money to someone, and I know that guy's going to give it to a terrorist group, here in Canada, that's a criminal offense. So I said, okay, what's happening? I said that these individual politicians are using government power, government policy, to ship money, and it's millions of dollars of money, millions of dollars of taxpayers' money, to Islamic Relief Canada. We mentioned them earlier as one of the Muslim Brotherhood front groups. Well, that's them. They're a registered charity here in Canada. Islamic Relief Canada has to publish financial statements because they are a federally registered charity. If you read their financial statements, they are shipping money in turn to something called Islamic Relief Worldwide in the United Kingdom. So, here's the thing. Members of Parliament plus the Prime Minister are taking taxpayers' money, giving it to Islamic Relief Canada. Islamic Relief Canada gives it to Islamic Relief Worldwide, and you go, okay, what's the beef? What's the problem? Here's the issue. The government of the United Arab Emirates says that Islamic Relief Worldwide is a Muslim Brotherhood terrorist group, it's a front group, and it funds Hamas and it funds terrorism. The government of Israel says this. The government of Bangladesh says this and has banned Islamic Relief Worldwide from operating in their country. You might have heard of something called HSBC. It is one of the largest banks in the world. It's a British-based bank, and HSBC has said, we're closing all the accounts of Islamic Relief Worldwide because as a major bank, we can't be seen to be funding terrorism with our activity. UBS is a bank you may have never heard of. It's one of those monster-grade Swiss banks that controls all kinds of crazy money and you never hear about them. But they looked at Islamic Relief Worldwide and said, we're closing their accounts because even we, the super secret Swiss bank, don't want to be fooling around with funding terrorism. Now, there's also something in the United Kingdom called the Charities Overwatch. And they, guess what, monitor charities. The Charities Overwatch says they have 4,000 charities registered in the United Kingdom that are Muslim, Islam, Islamist, or whatever in orientation. And they decided out of those 4,000 charities run by Muslims in the United Kingdom, they're going to ban one of them. Islamic Relief Worldwide. That's the one charity out of the 4,000 they banned. And they actually came out and said, this is not Islamophobia, this is not that. We've got 3,999 Muslim charities we allow to operate, except for that one. So, your taxpayers' dollars, and it's by the millions, are going from Ottawa to Islamic Relief Canada to Islamic Relief Worldwide, and it's going down to fund terrorism in places like Burma, the Palestinian territories, etc. Your taxpayer dollars are funding terrorism. So I put this all in the report to the RCMP, and some of the research was done by Tahir Gora, Muslim friend of mine. It was also signed by Rahil Reza, who's the head of Muslims Facing Tomorrow. It was signed by Ben. And we sent it to the RCMP, and 3 hours later got a response back that said, thanks for the email. 3 weeks later, I got a response back that said, thanks for the email, we've read the report, it's been sent down to the business line for operations, and here's the file number. And I just like, yes, it's got a file number. In other words, the RCMP has a criminal investigation open right now into the government of Canada for funding terrorism. So, feel free to ask Mr. Trudeau how it's going. Now, actually, I'll give you the file number later. I've got it written down here.
18-004212.
Okay. Hang on. Say that again.
18-004
212. That is the official RCMP file number on the report I gave them, requesting an investigation into terrorism in Canada. Now, surprisingly enough, everybody wasn't thrilled. Can you imagine? A group of folks who really weren't thrilled with this were Islamic Relief Canada. Now, interestingly, I didn't accuse them of funding terrorism. I just said they took money from the government and gave it to those guys over there. And I made no comment whatsoever on their politics, background, or history. However, nonetheless, I am being sued for libel by Islamic Relief Canada. And my suspicions are, and I have a hard time proving this, that they may have been helped along or pushed a bit by certain, influential political figures. Nonetheless, we're being sued for this, and I go like again, because this happens quite regularly. And this is a part of lawfare in Canada. Islamist groups love to sue newspapers, groups, individuals who speak out against them. I know members of the press who live in Toronto and Montreal who, when they want to publish a story, and if I'm giving them information, they say, I'm only allowed to publish one story a month on radical Islam. And what do you mean you're only allowed to publish one story? They say, we'll get sued if we publish more than one of that. So the media chill is real. The media in Canada don't write a lot of stories on radical Islam because they're afraid of being sued. They always win the lawsuits, but these things cost tens of thousands of dollars. They don't want to do it anymore. So that's kind of one of the things that's going on. So that's kind of a bit of the good news. The rest of the world's actually pushing in this issue. I've managed to get the RCMP upset enough they've actually opened a file number on this. It's got the government of Canada upset, it's got Islamic Relief upset, and if they're upset, that's a good thing. Now, if you get nothing else out of this, you forget my name, you forget where Lloydminster is, you forget everything, I want you to remember one thing from today. Qatar Papers. Now, why would you know or care about Qatar Papers? Qatar is a country in the Middle East. It has more money than the Saudis. They are that rich. They are the richest country in the Middle East. And the whole country is about that big. There's like something like 3 million people live there, of whom 200,000 of them are citizens and the rest are labor. So it is literally the richest country in the Middle East. They run something called Qatar Charity. And much like Islamic Relief Canada, it looks like a charity. They feed some starving kids here, they help some flood victims there, and on the surface they sound like all right folks. But there has just been a big intelligence leak in Qatar. And what happened is somebody at Qatar Charity that spends literally millions and millions and millions of dollars funding extremism, somebody got a hold of their computer, shoved in a USB stick and went download, 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 and downloaded several thousand documents from Qatar Charity showing who they were funding, who's making the application, where the money is going, and they are also able to prove that the money they're spending is specifically being spent to advance the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada, America, France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc. So I got a rather bizarre phone call from somebody I kind of know in the Middle East that I worked with in the past and said, we need you to set up a certain kind of email with a certain kind of encryption with a company in Switzerland. And I said, okay, why? They said, just open the stupid email. So I did, and I got a question. It says, read about the Qatar Papers, which I knew about. And then they said, do you want the Canadian ones? And I was like, hell yeah. Sure. So what did they send me? They sent me a stack of papers. And what is in those papers that's interesting that y'all want to know about, you're all going to read about later this year when we actually make them public. There are 8 projects being funded in Canada by the government of Qatar, specifically with the aim of spreading the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. And by funding, I mean millions. 900K here, 3.1 million there, 2.7 million there. This is big coin. And some of the institutions they're funding you may have heard of. They've been in the news. Now, here's another fun one. 9 Canadian politicians are named in the documents. 3 of them are Liberals. How does that work? 3 Liberals, 3 Dippers, 3 of them are NDP. 1 is a well-known conservative name, which you'll have read in the papers lately. And 2 of them are municipal politicians who don't have an actual party affiliation. So we got some Liberals, we got some Dippers, we got some Conservatives, and we've got some non-affiliated. So it's a non-partisan issue. This goes right across party lines. 1 of them was not at the time a federal cabinet minister, but is a federal cabinet minister now. Another one of the names you'll recognize as a leading mayor in Canada, not in Alberta. Now, so what this will show is the government of Qatar has spent millions and millions of dollars funding projects in Canada recommended by Canadian politicians in order to spread a violent ideology across the country. So if you wonder sometimes, why did that kid from Calgary, Salman Ashrafi, suddenly decide to quit TELUS and go off and be a suicide bomber? You know, people go, well, he watched a video on the internet and he blew himself up. It's like, no. There's a lot more to this than meets the eye. If you wonder why these kids are being radicalized, why they blow crap up, and why they're doing this sort of stuff, it is because they are being educated and trained in schools to do this kind of stuff. Some of the money running these schools comes from Qatar, designed specifically with the intent of isolating these children from the Canadian mainstream and shoving them down the path to violence. So the Qatar Papers are going to be fascinating for that reason. Now, Something else that's going to come fun out of this is the CBC and the Toronto Star. Their names are not in the paper first, but Al Jazeera is. Al Jazeera is the official state media of the government of Qatar. They get millions and millions and millions of dollars from the Qatari government to run this worldwide media system. Journalists who work for Al Jazeera have quit and walked away from it saying, I'm not a journalist, I'm a Muslim Brotherhood propagandist and I don't want to do this anymore. So Al Jazeera has been publicly identified and privately identified as the media arm of the government of Qatar used to spread the word of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, name me 2 Canadian organizations that are news orientated that did a documentary about Ahmed Syed Khadr and Omar Khadr and why Omar Khadr is really such a great guy. Guess who did the documentary? CBC and the Toronto Star. Guess where they got some of the money from? Qatar, from Al Jazeera. So Toronto Star is a private outfit, so maybe that's a separate story. But the Canadian Broadcasting Company belongs to you folk. You pay for it. They get $1 billion and something a year of taxpayers' money to do this. So why is a Canadian public-funded organization taking money from a foreign government to assist them in spreading extremism around Canada so they can soft pedal Omar Khadr and what a great guy he is? It just like fascinates me. So when these papers come out, we're going to make quite a significant contribution to the discussion, shall we say, about why we don't think foreign powers should be funding the CBC to advance the cause of Islamic extremism in Canada. And I'd love to hear the head of the CBC on that one. Quick little insight, senior executives from CBC have gone to work for Al Jazeera. There's a rotating door there. Anyway, now, just one more quick little teaser bit of information. One of these organizations is getting millions of dollars, is founded by an individual, and we'll name him. If you look him up, you'll know who he is. This individual has his own writings about why he's here in Canada. A 46-page paper where he says he's here to do jihad, he's here to destroy Canadian institutions, and he is here to replace Canadian institutions with proper Islamic institutions. And he's getting millions of dollars to run a school to advance this kind of stuff here in Canada. Fascinating little bit of information. That same individual is a negotiator who works for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So he was trying to negotiate between Al-Qaeda and ISIS when they got into an ideological dispute with each other. So a Canadian guy who's funded by a foreign government is working overseas to try and help ISIS and Al-Qaeda get along better so they can destroy more things. That's what your taxpayer dollars are helping to do. Now, quick little insight, the guy's kid is in jail. Fentanyl? No. Drunk driving? No. Terrorism charges. This guy's kid is in jail for terrorism charges. So when this comes out, it's going to be hoot. We're going to have a lot of fun discussing this. And we actually want to use this to go to the government of Canada and say, do you think foreign governments should be able to fund people like CDC, should they be able to fund mosque schools or whatever, to spread Islamic extremism in Canada? And by the way, some of these folks are registered charities at the same time. So that's going to be the fun stuff. Guitar papers are going to be out later this year, and it's going to be really interesting to see what we can do with it. Now, we got these questions in Medicine Hat and in Red Deer and Calgary. I get the same questions in Ottawa time. I get the same questions around the world. Tom, that's all very interesting, but what I can do? There's nothing I can do. And it's like, hell yes, there is something you can do. And what I want you to do right now, how many people have one of these things? One of the greatest technological advancements ever, one of the greatest curses on the planet, depending how you view it. But 3/4 of the freaking world now got one of these things. So, either take a picture or get your cell phone out right now. I know it's rude to use a cell phone in public when people are talking, but I would encourage you, get your cell phone out right now, and here's what we're going to do. Type into your email account, pm@pm.gc.ca. That is the email account that goes to the office of the Prime Minister, Mr. Justin Trudeau. So take a picture of that, do it now, and do it later this evening. And then send him a very short, very clear, very blunt message. Don't be critical of him. Don't go yelling and screaming at him. Nothing. Don't do anything. Just say this. Dear Mr. Prime Minister, we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. Now, one person does it, they'll go delete. 2 people do it, they'll go delete. 10 people do it, somebody's going to start saying, who the hell's sending this stuff? Where is it coming from? So do it. Here's another guy. Some of you might have heard of him. There's this dude called Andrew Scheer. Here's his email address. He's leader of the Conservative Party. I would strongly encourage you to do the same thing. Dear Mr. Scheer, we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. Same thing's going to happen. He's going to say, you get one of them, nobody cares. Get two of them, nobody cares. He gets 10 of them. His staff are going to start saying, where the hell is this coming from? And I can tell you it's coming from Alberta. That will get their attention because they think the Conservative vote here in Alberta is solid. But my trip here so far has shown me the Conservative vote here in Ottawa might be a bit soft. So here's the point. We can get Mr. Andrew Scheer's attention and say, we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. Now, I don't know a lot about the People's Party of Canada. I've never met Bernier. I'm not really strong on what he does and how he operates and all that kind of stuff. But I know he's out there, and I know he's running. So here's Bernier's email address, maxine.bernier@parliament.gc.ca. So I would say the same thing. Send him an email. Say, dear sir, we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. Yours truly. That will actually work. It has an effect. MPs hate that kind of stuff when it starts to show up in large numbers. Now, another thing you can do is your local member of parliament, your local provincial member of the provincial parliament, your local mayor, your local whatever. Go through the list, pick them out, and just send them a one-line email. We don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. What's your position on that? So that is something you can actually do. It actually has an effect. It actually works. Just a quick bit, if you want to look more into this sort of subject, myself and a few friends wrote a book on the danger of political Islam to Canada. It came out last year, written by myself, written by Tahir Gora, who is a Sufi Muslim from Mississauga who runs Tag TV. He hates these guys with a passion. He's incredibly knowledgeable. He's the guy that warned the Liberal Party about entryism into the party and was silenced because of it. Another friend of mine, Said Schweib, an Egyptian guy, whose life has been threatened with death. He's got a fatwa against him because of the Muslim Brotherhood. Jonathan Kotler, one of the sharper lawyers in Canada. He's the son of a guy you might recognize, Erwin Kotler, former Minister of Justice. So we have people who are strongly liberal working with us saying this is a warning. Not saying Justin Trudeau's read the book, but I am saying, the Kotler family's read it. And written by Rick Gill, guy here in Edmonton, military guy who does a lot of background and research and analytical work for me. So anyway, that's something if you're interested, that's on Amazon.com, Amazon.ca. Now, Operation Kill Switch. We're fighting a lawsuit right now. Your lawyer always tells you, go silent, don't talk about it. Your best chance of settling the lawsuit is just to be quiet. So the last lawsuit, we kept quiet, we paid $250,000, and now it's gone. We've decided to do something different now. We've talked to a lot of people and they said, let's turn this around. All those journalists who are being threatened with libel lawsuits, all those people like me that are being sued, let's turn this around and let's go public. So we started a GoFundMe site. We want to get money for legal fees, we want money for more research, but what we really need is people to hear about it. People that just want to sign your name and say you support this. You want to donate money? Great. If you don't, put a comment on there saying you support it anyway. The more people doing this, the more it goes. That is how Mark Norman, Admiral Norman, actually got his name out of the public record. That's when the Liberals started getting afraid of him, when thousands of people started going to different websites and saying, hey, screwing Mark Norman is the wrong thing to do. So what we're saying is we want to take this stuff public, we want to talk about it, we want Scheer to hear about it, we want Trudeau to hear about it, we want Jagmeet Singh to hear about it, we want Maxime Bernier to hear about it, and we want to get this public discussion on the public radar. We think our lawsuit with this, we think tours like this one in Alberta and other ones are going to follow, and we think the Qatar papers are going to take this year and we're going to turn the situation around for the first time, where this issue, which is always below the radar but nobody talks about it, we want people to talk about it during the election this fall, and that's why we're doing it. So thanks, folks, for coming out. Your being here is a part of this, and that's what we're up to. So thanks very much. Ben's going to come up. All right, so I'm going to give the microphone. All right, thanks very much. So right now I'm going to hand the microphone over. Carl's going to sort of walk around the audience. Anybody's got a question, please feel free to stick your hand up and wave around, and I'll answer from up here.
Questions? Here comes the mic. I'm going to start from the back and move to the phone. Okay. Here we go, my dear lady.
So I noticed that the political Islam is migrating into so many countries in the last several years, and I wonder, what's behind that? Is this some kind of globalist agenda, or is this Qatar? And I also wonder about the 8 politicians that were named. Are they actually funded by Qatar?
Okay, several different questions in there. Is political Islam spreading around the world? Yes, it is. Is it a deliberate policy? Yes, it is. The Muslim Brotherhood, which operates mostly out of Egypt, but also out of Turkey, Qatar, the United Kingdom, etc., has a willful policy of sending people around the world to build mosques, schools, cultural centers, whatever, to start spreading their message. And as I said, the Muslim Brotherhood now is in more than 80 different countries. That doesn't include groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, Al-Qaeda, the Abu Sayyaf group, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Boko Haram, and a whole bunch of others. So yes, it is spreading as a matter of willful policy. Who pays for all this? Qatar is probably the worst of a bad bunch right now. But also the Saudis are doing it, the Kuwaitis are doing it, and the Pakistani ISI is doing it. The Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency is funding people, including here in Canada and other countries around the world. So yes, it is a deliberate policy. Are the Canadian politicians supporting this? Well, they appear to be. They write letters of support for it. Are they being paid by the government of Qatar? At this point, I don't know if Canadian politicians have ever taken money directly from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Pakistan, or Qatar. What I do know is this money is coming in here in huge amounts and they're doing nothing to resist it. So that's a real problem. In France, there's two guys over there that have the same papers I've got, only for France, not Canada. They've already got a book that just came out, and they've said that French politicians either took money from the state of Qatar or they did this. They did nothing and just watched the money go by. So that's the French Qatar papers. We don't have that here in Canada. The papers I have don't show that politicians are taking it, but they do show that Canadian politicians appear to be willfully supporting this.
We have another question here.
So in your circle, do many people talk about adding the Muslim Brotherhood to the list of terrorist entities for Canada?
It has been discussed. I know that when Mr. Harper was Prime Minister, they actually started looking at not listing the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist entity, but looking at listing its front groups as terrorism entities. And I think you'll find the Americans are going to wind up doing the same thing. They won't list the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist entity, but they'll list CARE USA as a terrorist entity because it is Muslim Brotherhood front group. The government of the state of the United Arab Emirates are probably the leading world's experts on the Muslim Brotherhood because they really hate these guys. And they actually provided a list of 84 different Muslim Brotherhood front groups that they specifically listed as terrorism front groups. So I think we will see in America, you're going to see some of those groups will get listed. Here in Canada, I don't think it'll happen under the current government.
They're saying that they run out of money. So
It may be possible. Again, I don't know. I've heard all kinds of stories, all kinds of information, but let me just tell you a bit first about how I approach a problem like that, because a number of people come to me and say, I met this Muslim guy, he seems like a really nice guy, and I really like him, and whatever, but should I be worried about the organization? So when you look at a mosque or a cultural center, a school run, and you wonder to yourself, you say, are these good guys, bad guys? Because most of them are good guys. And I'll just say this, around the world, people are dying from Islamic terrorism, from Islamist terrorism specifically. The 10 countries in the world that have the biggest terrorism problem with people getting killed are Muslim majority countries. So as I talked about, there's two groups involved. One wants to be sort of peaceful and modern, the other people are violent and whatever. The radical Muslims, the Islamist Muslims, are killing more moderate Muslims than they're killing anyone else. That's a real problem. So anyway, to go back to your question specifically, if you want to look at an organization like the Fort Mac Mosque or the Dundas Street Mosque or whatever, it doesn't matter. First thing you do they have a full-time imam? Do they have a guy who's there all the time, like a regular priest or a regular minister kind of thing? If he is a member of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, that is the worst outfit on the planet for this kind of stuff. It is a listed terrorist group in the Middle East, IUMS, International Union of Muslim Scholars. The Toronto police chaplain, the Muslim guy, is a member of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, and it's just shocking that he's allowed to be there. So, first thing, is the imam a member of the International Union of Muslim Scholars? If is, he's full-on Brotherhood. That's their organization founded by their top guy. Now, there is also something called the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia. And this university was set up by the Saudi government to bring young fellas in from around the world, and they're young men, no women allowed. They are brought into Medina, they're housed, they're clothed, they are fed, and they are educated, and then they are sent back out to the rest of the world. And that university is designed to spread a hardcore, sort of Wahhabist, Salafist kind of interpretation of Islam. And if your imam is coming from that university, key indicator and warning, there's something truly wrong with that character. The next thing to do to look at a mosque before making any real decisions is to say, who do they bring in as speakers? Because a lot of the times you look at the mosque, it seems normal enough, the folks are friendly enough, they're not doing anything crazy, and you go, well, you know, they're nice people, or at least they seem to be. So look at who they bring in as foreign speakers. So recently, Islamic Relief Canada has brought in a couple of guys to speak in a bunch of mosques around Canada. The Saudi imam who they brought in for Ramadan a year ago was recorded in a variety of mosques saying, Ramadan is a month of conquest, jihad is our way, martyrdom is what we seek, and we need to kill the Jews, the Christians, and the infidels. So he actually stands up in mosque in Canada and says this. So if the mosque is bringing in that kind of guest speaker, indicator and warning, there's something quite wrong there. So again, the Fort Mac one, I confess that I haven't yet taken the time to go digging through the pile of information people keep sending me, but I will later this summer.
Thank you.
All right, can you take another question, Tom?
Yes.
Rob, you want to answer? I want to note for the purposes of the federal election that B. Sinet was not sentenced as of yet, and I'm waiting, and I think other operatives inside the Federal Conservative Party, etc., are waiting to see what happens with regard to him, because they've deliberately delayed sentencing of him. I believe they'll do it in around the time of the federal election. The crucial period is 3 weeks until election day. I hope that much of the information that comes out of the Qatar papers and others comes out at that time.
Yeah. A quick word, Mr. Anders is referring to B. Sinet. He was the fellow that went into the Quebec City Mosque with a rifle and opened fire on a bunch of folks. Killed them, murdered them, slaughtered them. The reality is, you heard about that attack. What you didn't hear about is the other 4 attacks at the same mosque. So, that mosque was once the victim of a pig's head dropped on its front door with a letter which was, you know, not too polite. There was also a campaign around the mosque where somebody put up a bunch of posters on telephone poles and walls saying, this is a Muslim Brotherhood mosque and it's doing bad things and you should be aware of it. Then somebody put up a website, which is still there bizarrely enough, that said, this is a Muslim Brotherhood mosque, this outfit has created horrible crimes around the world that are terrible, etc., whatever. Then there was the shooting event, which everybody in the world heard about, and then there was the burning of the imam's car, which most of you probably never heard about. Now, what's interesting is that mosque was actually founded by a guy who is on the Shura Council for the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. Most of the people who founded it and who helped him were Muslim Student Association, which is a Muslim Brotherhood front group. So my argument would be to you that that mosque was not attacked because it was Muslim, it was attacked because it was Muslim Brotherhood. I would also testify in court that that was a terrorist attack, i.e. it defined terrorism. It was an attack designed to destroy people who work for a religious political organization. It is the absolute definition of terrorism. But yet our government chose not to file terrorism charges for what might be legitimate reasons, but to me it strikes me as the most bizarre situation where that defined terrorism. He should have been charged as such, but if he was, it would have brought up the whole discussion of why he attacked the mosque. It's much easier just to say he's a crazy guy that doesn't like Muslims, rather than to actually address the issue of who ran the mosque, why they ran it, what their political beliefs were. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating the last few months before the election to see this kind of stuff and a bunch of other stuff come up. Carl?
Right, I got another question right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom Quiggin, for coming. Actually, you're an answer to prayer for a lot of years. My concern is you're waiting for the later summer for Fort McMurray, but Louis Farrakhan was on YouTube and he was basically saying that unless President Trump goes easy on Hillary Clinton, they're basically going to uprise in America. When Clintons came to Alberta here and they were looking at all our resources, they were looking at Alberta, northern Alberta, the largest uranium site, and I really feel that we're just putting our country in jeopardy. And also, I seen Jason Kenney kissing some Saudi prince just last week. So I'm just wondering if that's all to do with the Qatar, and if you're aware of all that stuff, just what I've just told you.
Is it directly connected to Qatar? No, not that I'm aware of. Is it more directly connected to the larger issue of political Islam spreading through Canada and America? The answer is yes, it is. When President Obama was President of America, he actually invited Muslim Brotherhood people into the White House on a fairly regular basis. They were in the State Department, and they are so upfront and arrogant about this stuff. You saw a bunch of them in the U.S. State Department doing this, giving the Muslim Brotherhood salute while they're inside the U.S. State Department. Valerie Jarrett, who was the more or less chief of staff to Obama for his entire range, is pro-Iranian, pro-Islamist, and whatever. So yeah, the American government under President Obama had a lot of people working in it who had interests in the Islamist view. Hillary Clinton, one of the reasons the Benghazi incident went so badly, and one of the reasons the whole Libya thing went so badly, is because she was working with Muslim Brotherhood people to try and get them into power in Libya. So if you ever look into that, it's a really awful, messy situation. But is the thing with Jason Kenney connected to the Qatar Papers? I don't believe so, no. So anyway, Carmen, where'd you go? Oh, there you are.
You got somebody in the back, Tom.
Way back there.
Or you can yell.
I'm going to have to run for this one.
I got a loud voice. Just because of what you're talking about right now, I have heard a lot about the people or the governments being involved in trying to take over land, like the Mawassan Valley Authority out of Saskatchewan. Especially here in Alberta, we've got the Bighorn is being taken over. Now we're clearly understanding that's based or directly or inadvertently through the UN agendas, specifically Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. Are those also something that is through this Muslim Brotherhood or the Qatar Papers that you're talking about? Or is that strictly the UN itself directives?
The short answer to the question is, I don't think it's connected. Let me give you a slightly larger answer. When the United Nations was formed, it was a relatively positive thing. It did a bunch of good stuff. I've served in Bosnia while wearing like a UN flag on my uniform, something I would do again. I think the UN still does a few good things like flood relief, UNICEF, and that kind of stuff. However, sort of like comma, pause for effect, the United Nations has some problems right now. And my personal view is Canada should distance itself from the United Nations. We should help out with the charity stuff. We should help out with, saving children. I got no problem with that. We should probably do the peacekeeping missions when they come up if they're viable. So that part I got no problem with. But here's my kind of hang up with the United Nations. For instance, they have a body that deals with human rights. And now they specifically have a body that deals with human rights for women. And sitting on the board of this thing are Iran, Qatar, Pakistan, and this sort of stuff. And you sit there and you look at it, the meetings they have, it's all full of men because they don't allow women to go to the meetings. Women aren't allowed to leave the home unless they have the permission of their wife. And women in Saudi Arabia are only now allowed to drive a car, but only with their husband's permission, only if a male guardian is with him. So why does the United Nations have a bunch of folks sitting on various boards, groups, and organizations who have zero interest in democracy, zero interest in human rights, etc.? They have a gay rights kind of thing, and there's folks like Iran sitting on the board. Now, just to be fair, Iran has a gay rights parade, but not what you'd recognize here in Canada. They take cranes and put one every couple of 100 yards down the street and hang gays from them. Seriously, they kill them on the street. So that's their gay pride parade, if you will. They actually hang gay people from cranes in the streets. Go into Google, look up gay pride in Iran, or look up crane and gay in Iran. You see all these pictures like construction cranes, the big ones that put air conditioners on the roof of buildings. Those cranes are used to hang gay people. That's their idea of a gay pride parade. So why are we supporting these clowns? Why are we involved with them? The United Nations is suffering heavily, I would say, from globalism, which is to say there are people who want to move in there to make migration a global issue, to tell Canada, America, and the rest of the West how many migrants you have to take, how much you're going to pay them, how you're going to pay them. And it's like, this is all great, but is the United Nations paying for this? Are they going to solve the problems? And of course, no, they're not. So I got some real problems with the United Nations. Now, the land claims thing here in Alberta, no idea. I don't think it's connected. It's not part of the Qatar Papers. But having said that, my personal feeling is the government of Canada should be pushing the United Nations away more, rather than trying to bring them in, which is what's happening right now. Carl?
One question, how far are we along in Canada, like infiltration, Tom? Oh, go.
Okay, tough question. So let me not answer that question, let me address another question, and then I'll come back to that. France, the country of France. Mr. Macron has just stood up and said, political Islam wants to secede from the Republic. I didn't tell you that Patrick Calvar is the head of their intelligence service. And he said a couple of years ago that if France gets a couple more terrorist attacks like the Bataclan bombing or the Charlie Hebdo bombing or whatever, that he thinks France will face a civil war because of this. And it will be the civil war between those who want to set up a whole series of little mini caliphates and the French Republic itself. Also under Macron, he has a Minister of the Interior, kind of like Minister of Public Safety kind of guy. And he served with Macron for about a year. And he literally got up one day and quit and walked away. Just no warning, no what. He just walked out of his office and said, I'm done. And people said, wow, why would you quit so suddenly? He goes, this political Islam is a major threat to France, and I can't get anybody's attention. I can't do anything with it, so to hell with it, I'm out of here. And he went back to being the mayor of Lyon. So the government of France also has 10,000 troops on the street every day, and they've had them there for over 5,000 years. It is a temporary emergency. When a temporary emergency lasts 5 years, you've got to figure it's now normalized. Why do they have 10,000 troops on the street every day? Like they have armed military infantry guys patrolling French streets. And the answer is the civil unrest that's coming from the Islamists and from the drug gangs that are controlled by the Islamists. That's why they put 10,000 troops on the street. Same thing's starting to happen in the United Kingdom. Germany's having the same problem. So, bring the question back to one you actually asked, what's going on in Canada? I don't think we are in the same position as France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. We are not that bad. We have problems. We're starting to get no-go zones. We are starting to have city councils that allow call to prayer in City Hall. We are starting to have city councils who allow Muslim-only housing sites. But I would argue that we are on the same trajectory, we are on the same path, and we are being infiltrated in all three of our mainstream political parties by people who are pushing this. So my sort of advice to the citizenry and to the government is start bringing a halt to this problem now before we wind up looking like France, which we're going to do in a few years.
Build a wall.
Wouldn't help, unfortunately. It's already inside. Sir?
Around the airport.
Got one more question here.
Just in regards to the Qatar papers, and when you go public with them later this year, how do you know you won't get shut down? Like, the news outlets won't cover them, and maybe just give you 20 seconds on a Wednesday night?
Oh, okay. So I already expect I will get very little cooperation from the mainstream news, especially when I'm sort of like naming them. So what are we going to do with the Qatar papers? When I get permission from a certain authority overseas that gave me the papers to go public with them, which I'm hoping is mid-June, if not it'll be later in the summer, we're going to do several things to get the message out. The first thing will be the Quiggin report. We're going to run several podcasts explaining to people what they are, how it happened, who the names are, what the project's involved, and all that sort of stuff. I've gone to my colleague, Tahir Gora, who I mentioned earlier, my co-author. Tahir, God love him, owns a TV station in Mississauga. And he and I are going to do 7 half-hour episodes on the Qatar papers, explaining the role of Tariq Ramadan in Canada, explaining the role of various mosques, explaining why the schools are isolating the children, etc., etc. We also have a promise from the foreign media to cover this. So a newspaper in Cairo has already covered me, the Qatar papers, and they're already talking about it. So in Egypt, the mainstream media is actually talking about what's going on in Canada, but in Canada, the mainstream media won't. Now, I also know, just something else I forgot to mention earlier, there is a newspaper in Cairo, Egypt, which has a story coming out this week or next week. And it is going to say that the Muslim Brotherhood has taken over the Arab Studies Department of the University of Ottawa. So I happen to know this because I know who the author is and I work with folks overseas and whatever, but an Egyptian newspaper is going to write an article with names, dates, and places that identifies how the University of Ottawa Arab Studies Department has been taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know if the Canadian media will cover that, but we're going to actually push it through our side. We're going to make sure folks like you hear about it. And we think it is so embarrassing that the mainstream media at some point may have to cover this. Now, another quick little story I didn't discuss. I read a thing in the CBC a couple of years ago. I just kind of, you flip through the news, just what's interesting and what's not. And I rarely read the CBC anymore, but I saw this thing pop up, and it said, noisy library students have police called on them. And I thought, what is our national broadcaster doing writing a story about noisy library students at the university caused so much disruption they called the cops? And I read the story, and it says a bunch of noisy students caused disruption. It got so bad, they called the police. The teachers' union wants the police to take some action to silence and whatever. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, what? It's stupid. Like, what's going on? Why is this in the news? Anyway, it says it's happening at Maisonneuve College, which is in Montreal. I thought, aha. Go into French media. And I read enough French that I can understand what's going on in the French media. So I looked up Maisonneuve College, and La Presse wrote this extensive story talking about how a bunch of students tried to leave Montreal and go to ISIS. They got captured at the Montreal airport and sent back and said, no, you can't go to ISIS. They got arrested, they got peace bonds. They're students at Maisonneuve College. There are 2 students at Maisonneuve College who were arrested on bomb charges. They're at Maisonneuve College awaiting trial. Guess which students are causing the disruption in the library? Guess which students threatened the lives of the librarian? Guess which students went out into the parking lot and were taking photos of license plate numbers and threatening other students? Guess which students told other students they can't use the common areas anymore because only ISIS students are allowed to use them? So I looked at this and I thought, holy crap. In Montreal, in the press, they're talking about how ISIS people who support the ISIS cause, have gone to Maisonneuve College and are threatening the lives of university staff as they try and take over part of the university. CBC writes the story and says, noisy students get the cops called on them. So that's the kind of thing we're hoping to get attention drawn to. So we're actually hoping between now and the election, we're going to force people through the guitar papers, through this, through foreign press, which has a stronger interest than our own press, to get this issue up onto the public radar. So my own feeling is the election's coming. Everybody knows it, not a secret. There's going to be some issues. I might suggest to you the economy will be one, because it always is. Carbon tax maybe, given that like almost all the provinces are against it. So economy, carbon tax, and the record of Justin Trudeau. He's a serving prime minister. He's been in power for almost 4 years. So to discuss his record during an election is a totally normal thing. But what I think is going on is we are going to see the 4th issue in this election is going to be the role of radical Islam in Canada. We're not allowed to say that, because if you talk about it, you're some kind of alt-right, right-wing, neo-Nazi extremist, something Islamophobic, whatever. But what we are seeing increasingly is people are talking about migration, national security, gun control, and I think these are all code words for the great thing we're not allowed to talk about. This is sort of the Harry Potter thing, he who cannot be named. This is where we're at. But I do think that between now and the election, we might actually get this issue up on the table, and we might be able to get some politicians to actually say they have a position for or against political Islam. They approve of the Brotherhood in Canada, or they don't. They approve of foreign funding for terrorists in Canada, or they don't. So anyway, that's kind of my hope for the election, and I'm actually like a little bit positive on this, more than many.
Can the United Nations, if Trudeau loses office, can the United Nations take us over at any point, Tom?
No.
Okay.
Not that they wouldn't like to, not that they won't try to infiltrate. Speaking of which, I was going to mention this one last thing. Missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry. That thing failed on a number of levels. It took years. All kinds of people quit the thing and quit in disgust, and they were angry. Part of the problem was there was 2 groups of people working there. One group of people wanted to have an inquiry into why so many Native women wind up murdered, why they wind up missing, why they wind up in people trafficking outfits, and why they wind up as prostitutes in Toronto or Vancouver. And most Canadians kind of look at it and go, yeah, it sounds sensible enough. It's like the Air India inquiry. What the hell is happening? Good stuff. The other group of people in it, though, were 4th wave feminists. And they wanted to show why intersectionality, why modern feminism, and all this sort of stuff is what needs to be done. And they were using the inquiry solely to advance a political agenda, and they quite frankly didn't give a damn about 14-year-old girls who wind up dead in the Red River in Manitoba. But what they did come up with and say, genocide is occurring in Canada. And I mean, I've worked for the War Crimes Tribunal. I've seen what a genocide looks like on the ground in Bosnia. And what's happening here in Canada is not genocide. The largest part of those women are being murdered by their own partners. It's domestic violence, it's people trafficking, it's a drug problem, it's prostitution, and it is a large ignorance on the part of the Canadian population. It's a lack of will on the part of the politicians to engage in the issue. It ain't friggin' genocide. Except Prime Minister Trudeau stood up and said, yes, genocide is occurring in Canada. And I just thought, holy crap, excuse my French, this guy is head of government. He's not head of state, but he's head of government. He is responsible for the government of Canada, and he has just said to the world that the government of Canada is committing genocide on Canadian territory. It's like, if you don't think all the people around the world that don't like Canada are going to come charging into Canada, demanding an inquiry into genocide, you're nuts. The Organization of the American States is already doing it. Now, here's another little thing. Mr. Trudeau has upset a lot of folks, if you haven't noticed. We're not exactly at the top of the list of the Indians right now. We're not on the top of the list of the Chinese. Our American friends aren't too thrilled with us. Canada is not back. But now Mr. Trudeau has publicly stated that the government of Canada is committing the world's worst form of criminal activity, which is genocide. I have no idea where this is going, but having worked in this field for a long time, I think it's going to be hugely damaging to Canada. The United Nations, to answer your question directly, is going to have a field day sending people up here. We're here to investigate genocide, and your Prime Minister said so. Yeah, and I got a whole bunch of views on Trudeau. I shouldn't go into too many of them, but the reality is I've watched this guy for years, and what I can tell you, the way he thinks, the way he speaks, his globalist views, whatever, anytime he is presented with an issue, he immediately defaults to political correctness and virtue signaling. I don't think he actually thinks about the problem. It's a media thing. He wants to be seen to be woke. He wants to be seen to be a progressive. And I think this time, he shot himself in the foot and he shot us in the foot. Anyway, Carl.
You good?
Oh. This is so good.
Okay, last question. Here we go.
I just want to ask you, like, with the pipeline and the oil not moving in Alberta, is there any connection to the Qatar and their political influence in shutting these pipelines down? And I found it so interesting, your comment about the moss going to Fort McMurray and the other lady's comment about uranium. And I'm just wondering, is there something going on here that, like a backstory that we don't know about?
So, just short question. Is there influence showing in the Qatar papers about oil and pipeline? No. Is Qatar influencing that thing directly? No. Now, let me go a little off course on that and say, why is it the government of Canada, it wants to block pipelines, wants to block saltwater access in British Columbia to oil, but yet at the same time, we sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and we allow Saudi Arabian oil to come up into Canada? How? By tankers up through a long river into a congested port. And not to be conspiratorial, I'm not saying there's any grand conspiracy going on here, but the government of Canada has had pressure put on it through a series of funding initiatives, through the United Nations and all this stuff. And we've actually got to a point where we think it's acceptable to import Saudi oil, which is some of the dirtiest oil in the world based on its human rights issues. The folks who work in the oil fields there are essentially slaves. The Shia Muslims that do most of the work are treated like crap. The Saudi royal family is one of the most abusive outfits on the planet, and we are using Canadian money to support them. And then I look at this and say, but we won't take Alberta oil and move it to salt water. And it just kind of looks to me and it says, this is a complete misalignment of Canadian national interest versus globalist views. So as a Canadian, you would think our Prime Minister would be most interested in Canada first and then globalists. So think what you want about old Jean Chrétien, think what you want about Brian Mulroney, Kimmy Campbell, Joe Clark, Mike Pearson, all those guys, even Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father. Whatever he was doing, one always got the impression, whatever it was, it had something to do with Canada. You might not agree with his vision of Canada, you might not agree with how they were treating Canada, you might have been angry about how they were filling their pockets with Canadian money, but my impression was they were always Canada first and everybody else next. This is the first Prime Minister I think we've had who self-describes as a post-nationalist, he self-describes as a globalist, and he's clearly interested in globalist views over ones of Canadians. So I think that's a large part of why you see this disconnection. People say, you know, he's just trying to destroy the Alberta economy. It's like, no, I don't think he is. He's not waking up in the morning going, how do I screw Alberta? But I do think he is waking up in the morning and saying, how do I do a globalist agenda? How do I accommodate the Saudis? How do I do this? And in so doing, it's killing Alberta. And by the way, it's not helping Ontario either. You might want to know that. Ontario is the world's largest non-sovereign debtor. We owe more money than Alberta. We owe more money than California. We're busted. Why? Because of these kinds of policies. So yeah, Trudeau himself is a globalist, and I genuinely believe he puts a sort of George Soros, Jean-Claude Juncker kind of mentality to work while he's working, which lends itself to this kind of thing. And I think if he gets re-elected, unless he kind of reforms and moves back a bit, I really think it's, if you think it's bad now, I think it's going to get much worse.
Yeah, and didn't George Soros like kill his own?
All right, well, I know there's other speakers. We're going to get the high sign here from Carol, so I'm going to just turn this over to Ben for a bit. I'm apolitical. I am, at the end of the day, I'm a militant, nonpartisan. I don't really like any political parties all that much. That's because of my military training, my intelligence training, whatever. Ben, on the other hand, is completely political, and he's going to talk about some of the political stuff and how we want you folks to help yourselves and help us.
Ladies and gentlemen.